Greetings everyone. This is Eclipse Wizardry. Prepare yourselves for, what if Narcissa Black kissed Harry at age 5 and her ancient magic refused to let any other woman in? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Grey Afternoon. The market smelled like rain and burnt sugar. It occupied the lower half of Diagon Alley's western fork, a stretch that didn't appear on the tourist maps and wasn't mentioned in the guidebooks sold at Flourish and Blots. You had to know to tap the third brick left of the broken gas lamp, and then the wall would shutter open onto a cramped lane of canvas stalls and low wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs. The wizarding families who used it called it the Undercroft Market. It ran on the last Saturday of every other month. It sold things that weren't strictly regulated, and it smelled perpetually of the rain that never quite reached it and the sugar that burned in the iron pot of the old woman who made blood-orange caramels at the lane's far end. Narcissa Malfoy did not typically shop at the Undercroft Market. She had people for that. She had Gallius, the Malfoy estate's procurement wizard, who handled anything that needed handling. She had accounts at every reputable establishment in Wizarding Britain, and her name opened doors that money alone could not. She did not browse stalls. She did not carry her own bags. She certainly did not come to a market that smelled like weather and confectionery alongside witches in wool robes who haggled over dried beetles. And yet here she was, because Lucius had wanted a particular grimoire from a particular dealer who operated only out of the Undercroft, and Lucius was in a meeting with Borgin that had been running for 3 hours now, and Narcissa had decided, in the quiet, precise way she decided most things, that she would rather be somewhere else. The grimoire was under her arm. She had found it in 11 minutes. She was walking back toward the entrance, navigating between a family of 5 who seemed incapable of walking in a straight line and a man trying to coax a cage of agitated fire crabs onto a lower shelf, when she almost stepped on the child. He was sitting on the cobblestones behind a barrel of dried salamander tails, which was why she hadn't seen him. He had his knees pulled to his chest and a look on his face that she recognized immediately and viscerally, the particular expression of a child who has learned that being small and still and invisible is the safest available option. His hair was dark and badly cut. His clothes were too large by 2 sizes in every direction, the sleeves of his gray jumper falling past his hands so that only his fingertips showed. He was watching the crowd with enormous green eyes from behind glasses that sat slightly crooked on his nose. Narcissa stopped. She was not a sentimental woman. She had been raised not to be, in a household where sentiment was treated as a structural weakness, the kind of crack in a foundation that water finds first. She had Draco, and what she felt for Draco was not sentiment, it was something that operated more like bedrock, load-bearing and foundational, not soft. She did not stop for children she didn't know. She did not collect strays. But there was something about the way this child sat, the architectural precision of his smallness, the deliberateness of having tucked himself exactly far enough out of the foot traffic to avoid being stepped on without being far enough to be removed from it entirely, as though he was rationing proximity to other people, that made her feet go still before her mind had issued any instruction. She looked at him more carefully. The scar registered second, which was unusual. In most wizarding circles, it would have registered first, a lightning bolt above the right brow, faded silver pink, the kind of scar that had been discussed in hushed voices for 4 years now. But she'd noticed the eyes first, and then the deliberate smallness, and then the scar, and by the time she'd completed that sequence she'd already crouched down to his level, which was something she had not consciously decided to do. "You're by yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. The boy looked at her with the particular wariness of a child who has learned that adult attention is not reliably safe. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either, which told her something about him, that he'd learned to assess rather than flee. "I'm not going to send you anywhere," she said, because that seemed to be what he was calculating. "Is someone here with you?" A beat. Then, "My aunt." His voice was small but not trembling. "She went to the apothecary. I wasn't allowed inside because I knocked something over last time." "It was an accident," he added, with the precision of a child who has said those 3 words so many times they've worn smooth. Of course it was, Narcissa said, and something in her tone must have been different from what he was used to, because he looked at her with a flicker of surprise, as though he'd braced for contradiction and hadn't received it. She studied him for a moment. The jumper had a small burn hole near the collar that someone had attempted to mend with the wrong color thread. His trainers were clean but the soles were separating at the toe on the left foot. He was thin in a way that had nothing to do with metabolism. "What's your name?" she asked. Another assessment. Then, Harry. She offered him hers in return, which she did not typically do with strangers, let alone small ones. Narcissa. He tried it out quietly, the way children do when they're checking if a word is safe. "That's a constellation," he said. She blinked. "Yes. It is. My neighbor has a book about space. She lets me read it sometimes when her son doesn't want it." He said this without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. "There's a Narcissus myth too, but that's not a constellation, that's a flower and also a man who drowned." "Also a man who was rather too fond of himself," Narcissa said, and something shifted in the boy's expression, a cautious opening, the way a window creaks before it swings. He almost smiled. "Are you? Fond of myself?" She considered this with a seriousness she rarely applied to questions from people this height. "In some respects. Less so in others." He nodded, as though this was a satisfying and honest answer. Around them the market continued its commerce. The fire crab man had given up and was trying a different approach. The family of 5 had dispersed into 3 different stalls. The blood orange caramel smoke drifted past in a sweet, acrid curl. The boy, Harry, watched her with those green eyes that were, she thought, far too old for his face. She should stand up. She should go back to the entrance and wait for Lucius's meeting to conclude. She had the grimoire. She had no business sitting on her heels behind a salamander tail barrel talking to a child with a lightning bolt scar and a burn hole in his collar. Instead she said, "Hold out your hand." He did, after a brief consideration, extending one small hand palm up from the cave of his oversized sleeve. She reached into the paper bag she'd bought from the blood orange caramel woman. She had done that automatically, without really deciding to, and placed one of the wrapped sweets in his palm. He looked at it. Then at her. "My aunt says I'm not supposed to take things from strangers." "Your aunt sounds like she has some sensible instincts," Narcissa said. "She's also not here. And I'm telling you it's safe." She held his gaze. "I wouldn't give a child something harmful. That's not who I am." He seemed to weigh this against whatever internal accounting system he used for adults, and whatever he found must have passed, because he unwrapped the caramel with careful fingers and put it in his mouth. His expression changed immediately, not dramatically, not in the exaggerated way of a child performing delight, but in the subtle way of someone who has been given something unexpectedly good and doesn't quite know what to do with the feeling. "It's warm," he said, with some surprise. "Still warm." "How is it still warm?" "Magic," Narcissa said, which was true and also insufficient. "The caramel stayed warm in your mouth for about 30 seconds, which was a small enchantment but a rather lovely one." Harry was quiet for a moment, working through the caramel, and Narcissa should have stood up by now. She was very aware of this, but there was something happening in her chest that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't maternal, exactly, though it carried some of the same weight as the feeling she had for Draco. It was more like recognition. Like turning a corner and seeing a house you've seen before but can't place, the certainty of familiarity without the memory to support it. She was a Black before she was a Malfoy. The Black family had always had a particular sensitivity to magic, not raw power, but perception. They felt the currents of it the way some people claim to feel weather changes in their bones. Narcissa had it less than Bellatrix, who had it in a form that had long since collapsed into something else entirely, but she had it. She felt things. She read rooms. She noticed. She was noticing something now about the air around this child, and she could not have put it into words even if she'd wanted to, which she didn't, because putting something into words made it real and real things had consequences. He finished the caramel and looked up at her again. "Are you someone important?" he asked. She considered how to answer that. "In some circles. My aunt says important people don't sit on the floor." "She sounds exhausting," Narcissa said, before she could stop herself. Harry's almost smile became, briefly, an actual smile, small and fast, there and gone, like light off water, and something in Narcissa's chest did something she chose not to examine. She stood up, finally. Brushed imaginary dust from her robes. Looked down at him, this small complicated person with his ancient eyes and his too large jumper and his famous scar that she had, up until approximately 10 minutes ago, associated primarily with the fall of the Dark Lord and the specific way that fall had complicated everything in her life. He was looking up at her with the expression of someone who expects that the good part of the conversation is now over. She didn't know why she did what she did next. She had thought about it afterward, many times, in the months and years that followed, and she had never arrived at a satisfying analytical explanation. She was not an impulsive woman. She was, in fact, known specifically for not being impulsive. She had survived the war years in her household through the precise application of restraint. But she crouched back down, took his small face in one hand, and pressed her lips to his forehead, not to the scar, slightly above it and to the left, the way she sometimes kissed Draco, and it was entirely maternal, entirely instinctive, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds. And the world changed. She didn't feel it the way she would later understand it. She felt it the way you feel a door closing in another room, a distant resonance, a shift in air pressure, the structural suggestion of something significant having moved. Her magic, which usually sat in her chest like a sleeping cat, turned over and opened its eyes. She pulled back immediately, searching his face for alarm or confusion. Harry was looking at her with those green eyes, and his expression was something she had never seen on a 5-year-old's face before, something almost ancient, almost resigned, like a person recognizing the beginning of a long journey they can't decline. "You're kind," he said quietly. It was not a compliment so much as an observation, and it landed in her chest like a stone in still water, sending rings outward. She heard her name then, Lucius, 50 yards back, having emerged from Borgins with the particular sharp edge in his voice that meant he'd been looking for her. She straightened fully. Looked down at Harry one more time. "Get your aunt to fix your glasses," she said. "The left hinge is bent." She walked away without looking back, and she did not understand for a very long time that the woman she was when she'd entered the Undercroft market was not the woman who left it. Petunia Dursley found Harry behind the salamander tail 17 minutes later and informed him, with a quiet viciousness that she'd perfected over 4 years of practice, that he had better not have touched anything, eaten anything, or spoken to anyone, because wizard kind was not their world and they would do well to remember that, and if he had caused any trouble she would not be responsible for what Vernon said when they got home. Harry said he hadn't done anything. This was technically true in every way that mattered to Petunia. She marched him back through the Undercroft entrance and along the back streets to where the car was parked, and Harry sat in the back seat with his knees pressed together and watched the city move past the window and thought about the woman with the constellation name. There was something on his forehead where she'd kissed him. Not physically, he'd checked with his fingers and there was nothing there, no mark, no warmth on the skin. But inward. Like a light had been turned on in a room he hadn't known existed. He was 5. He didn't have language for any of this. But he knew that the woman had looked at him, not at his scar, not at the space above his head, not at something she expected to see. She had looked at him, and the difference between those things was something he had already learned to measure carefully, because most people looked at the scar, and the ones who didn't look at the scar looked at the jumper or the glasses or the wrongness of him that the Dursleys communicated to every room they shared without saying a word. She had looked at Harry. And then she had given him a caramel that was still warm, and she had told him his aunt sounded exhausting, which she did, and she had kissed his forehead the same way he'd once seen Mrs. Figg kiss the top of Mr. Tibble's head when she thought no one was watching, not a performance of affection, just affection itself, plain and direct. The car hit the motorway. Petunia turned the radio to something that wasn't music. Dudley, in the front seat, fell asleep almost immediately with a half-eaten bag of crisps in his lap. Harry pressed his forehead gently against the car window and felt the cool glass against the place where she'd kissed him, and the internal light, which he'd half expected to fade, didn't fade at all. Number 4, Privet Drive was exactly as it always was, which was to say, it was a house that had been furnished and decorated and maintained with tremendous precision and zero warmth, a place where every surface was clean and every cushion was straight and every photograph contained people who were not Harry. His cupboard was under the stairs. It was 4 feet wide and approximately 6 feet deep. It smelled like old shoes and the particular dusty darkness of enclosed spaces. The camp bed took up most of the floor, and the single shelf held the things that were technically his: a cracked torch, 3 books from the school library that were due back, a change of clothes. There was a small vent in the wall near the floor that let in a thin thread of air from the hallway. Harry sat on his camp bed in the dark, because the cupboard didn't have a light, and thought. Petunia had taken away the library books because he'd been at that market, and the fact that she'd left him outside an apothecary in a wizarding lane for 40 minutes was not, apparently, relevant to the conversation. Dinner had been the ends of bread and a glass of water. Dudley had chips. He was used to all of this. It was the texture of his life, the same way the wonky glasses were the texture of his face, the way the too big jumper was the texture of his body. He didn't spend much energy on it. What he spent energy on, small, careful amounts of energy, because he had learned early that hope was a thing to be rationed, was the question of why magic did what it did for him. He knew it was magic. He'd known for 2 years. He'd worked it out from the incidents, the time he'd ended up on the school roof when Dudley's gang was chasing him, the time his hair had grown back overnight after Petunia cut it close to his scalp, the time he'd turned his teacher's wig blue and hadn't done it on purpose. He'd kept a list in his head because paper was monitored. He knew the shape of it, knew the feel of it, this thing that lived in him and responded to his desperation or his fury or sometimes just his need. He knew other people didn't have it, that it was the reason the Dursleys looked at him the way they did, the thing that made Vernon's face go a particular red. But tonight there was something new. The something new wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with noise or color or any of the signs he'd catalogued from the accidental incidents. It was subtle, a change in the quality of the dark inside his cupboard. The cold that always settled into the space by 9 o'clock in the evening, a particular seeping chill that came through the wall from the front hall where the stone floor was never warm, wasn't there. He checked, the way he always checked, pressed his hand against the wall. The stone was warm. Not body temperature warm. Not heated artificially warm. Just, not cold. The chill was gone, as simply as that, and the space around him had taken on a quality like late afternoon sunlight, even though there was no light in the cupboard at all and the narrow vent showed nothing but hallway darkness. He sat very still. The warmth didn't go away. After a while, he lay down on the camp bed and pulled the thin blanket over himself, and the cupboard stayed warm around him, and he went to sleep faster than he usually did, and he did not dream of anything frightening. 3 miles across London, in a different kind of dark entirely, the luxury dark of heavy curtains and high ceilings and a bedroom that cost more than most people's houses, Narcissa Malfoy sat at her dressing table and looked at her own reflection. The grimoire was on the table beside her. She hadn't opened it. She'd been sitting here for 40 minutes since returning from the market, and she hadn't done anything except sit and look at herself and try to account for what she felt. The Black family's sensitivity to magical currents was not subtle when something significant had happened. It was like standing too close to a lightning strike, not painful, but physically present, the air changed, the hair standing up. She'd felt it before, twice, in her life. Once when Bellatrix had done something at the height of the war that Narcissa had never asked to know the specifics of, and once when Draco was born and his magic had announced itself by turning the delivery room's 20 candles into small blue suns. She'd felt it this afternoon. Behind a barrel of salamander tails, crouched on cobblestones in a market she didn't normally frequent, with a child she'd never met. Lucius had asked her on the drive home if she was well. She'd said yes. He hadn't pushed, which was typical. Lucius was not a man who pushed into things he suspected he didn't want to find. He'd talked about the grimoire acquisition instead, satisfied that she'd retrieved it, and she'd made the correct responses and thought about green eyes and a burn hole in a collar all the way back to the manor. She was not naive. She had a significant education in magic theory, had spent her school years in the top tier of her classes, and had continued her studies afterward with the particular focus of a woman who understood that knowledge was the one currency that couldn't be confiscated. She understood what ancient magic was, not well, nobody understood it well, but enough. It was the deep current beneath all performed and learned and wand-channeled magic. It was the kind that predated spells and schooling. It was what moved before thought, what responded to love and sacrifice in ways that theoretical frameworks had never successfully captured. She also understood that it did not typically respond to a kiss on the forehead given to a stranger's child in a market stall. Unless, her reflection suggested, you hadn't quite been a stranger. She looked at herself for a long time. Narcissa Malfoy, née Black, 31 years old, looking precisely as she was supposed to look at 31, not a hair misaligned. And underneath all of it, something that had been sleeping since the war had reached its worst, something she'd very deliberately and very successfully buried, had turned over and opened its eyes, exactly the way her magic had. She thought about the child's face when she'd said his aunt sounded exhausting. The involuntary smile. She thought about how he'd held out his hand. She thought about the quality of the air when she'd kissed his forehead, the resonance, the pressure change, the sense of a door closing in another room. She had felt magic move. She had caused it to move, or it had moved through her, or both. The distinction was not clear. What was clear was that something had been invoked that she hadn't intended and could not now uninvoke, and that it was connected to a 4-foot-tall person who probably had no idea anything had happened. Or perhaps he did. He'd had those eyes. She opened the grimoire to pass the time, not looking at any page specifically. Lucius came to bed at 10:30 and was asleep in minutes. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the manor breathe around her, the old stone and old wood, the magic in the walls that had been accumulating for 6 generations of Malfoys, and underneath all that familiar ambient hum, something new. Faint. Warm. Specific. Like a pilot light staying lit in a cold room somewhere. She pressed her fingers to her lips in the dark. She thought, what have I done? Not with fear. Not with horror. With the precision of a woman who keeps very careful accounts and has just identified a new and significant entry. Then she thought, he was cold in there. Wherever he sleeps. He was cold. And the something in her chest, the warm specific thing, pulsed once like a second heartbeat. She didn't sleep for a long time. The month of September came and went, and then October and November, and by the time winter settled into Privet Drive with its particular grey weight, Harry had stopped trying to explain to himself what the warmth in the cupboard was and had simply accepted it, the way children accept things that happen reliably, not with analysis but with the deeper knowledge of pattern. The cold didn't come in anymore. That was a fact the same way the shelf was a fact and the crack in the cupboard door was a fact. He lived with it. What he also lived with, and this was newer and stranger, was the way certain things no longer worked on him the way they used to. Vernon's shouting, for instance. Vernon had a voice that operated as a physical force, it took up space, it pressed against the walls, it had a quality of threat that went beyond volume. Harry had always felt it as something that made him smaller, a compression of self that he'd accepted as natural. Since September, the shouting still happened, but it didn't compress him anymore. He heard it with a clarity that was almost analytical. He noticed when Vernon's face went a particular color. He noticed the volume and pitch. He didn't feel the smallness. He felt something else instead. Something underneath his ribs, low and steady, like the warm wall in the cupboard. A kind of baseline sureness that hadn't been there before. He didn't know what it was. He was 5, almost 6, and he didn't have the framework for it. He just knew that when Vernon stood in the kitchen doorway and told him he was worthless and strange and that no one would ever want him, the words arrived and were heard and then did not stick. It was like being told rain was blue. You could hear the claim, process its structure, and simply know it was wrong. He started paying more attention to his own magic after that. Not testing it, not pushing it, he'd learned early that accidental incidents led to the cupboard, but watching it. Noticing where it was, the way you notice background noise once you start listening for it. It was always there, always present, but it had a different quality now, a groundedness that reminded him of the way the stone wall felt warm against his hand. He found, by winter, that he could do small things intentionally if he was very calm and very precise. The cracked torch could be encouraged into working longer than its batteries should have allowed. The library books, when he held them, sometimes fell open to the page he needed. Once, when Petunia threw a glass at him, not meaning to hit him, meaning to make a point, or so he'd tell himself later, it had stopped in mid-air 3 feet from his face, hung there for 2 full seconds, and settled on the counter. Petunia had gone very white and very silent and then had left the kitchen, and she had not thrown anything at him since. These were small things. They didn't fix anything. Dudley still took his food. He still slept in the cupboard. He still spent Christmas watching through the crack in the door while presents were opened and a tree glittered and a family that was not his performed its rituals. But he didn't feel abandoned in the way he used to. That was the only word he had for the change, even at 5.5, abandoned. He used to feel it as a constant background state, the sense of having been set down and not retrieved, of existing in a space between being wanted and being discarded. That feeling was gone. In its place, something quieter and more solid. Something that didn't require explanation. He pressed his hand to the warm cupboard wall on Christmas Eve and listened to the sounds of the house above him, and he felt, not happy, not entirely, the situation was not a happy one, but held. The way something is held when it's being kept for a purpose. Not forgotten. Not lost. He fell asleep on Christmas Eve in a warm cupboard while snow fell outside on Privet Drive, and he didn't dream of anything frightening, and that had not been true before September. Whatever the woman with the constellation name had done to him that gray afternoon, he didn't know, and wouldn't know for many years. But the warmth of it was already something he'd wrapped himself around, the way you wrap yourself around the last good thing, when it's the only good thing, and you've decided that's going to be enough. It was enough. He was 5 years old and already he understood that some things you can't explain but you can trust, and this was one of those things, and it was his, and nothing that came from the direction of the Desleys had ever made him feel anything close to it, and he was keeping it. Whatever it cost. Chapter 2, What the Mirror Doesn't Show. The first book arrived on a Tuesday. Harry was 9, and he'd been walking home from school through the cut between the Morrisons' car park and the back of the estate, which was 3 minutes faster than the road and also generally free of Dudley and his friends, when he noticed the parcel on the wall outside number 4. Not on the doorstep, on the low garden wall, sitting upright against the brick as though someone had set it there with care. Brown paper, twine, and his name in handwriting he didn't recognize. No return address. No postage marks. He'd taken it inside before Petunia could see it. Instinct, quick and clean. In the cupboard, under the thin light of his torch, he unwrapped it. A Concise History of Ancient Magical Theory, Volume 1. No author listed. No publisher. The cover was a dark green that shifted slightly depending on the angle, and when he opened it the pages had the warm dusty smell of something genuinely old, something that had been read before by hands that weren't his. There was no note. He read the first 4 chapters before Petunia knocked on the cupboard door and told him he'd better not be up. He kept the book behind the loose skirting board at the back of the cupboard, which he discovered at 7 contained a small hollow space just large enough for things he needed to not exist as far as the Dursleys were concerned. The second book came 6 weeks later. Foundations of Wandless Workings, a primer. Same brown paper, same twine, same unknown handwriting. Then, Practical Magical Theory for Independent Study. Then the Properties of Living Enchantments. Then a slim, battered volume with no title on the spine that turned out to be a handwritten journal, anonymous, but clearly belonging to someone who had spent years documenting the behavior of what they called deep magic, the kind that operated below the surface of all formal spellwork. By the time Harry was 9 years old and halfway through his 3rd year at Cavendish Primary, he had 11 books hidden behind the skirting board, and he had read each one at least twice, and he understood things that no child his age should have had any access to understanding, and the magic inside him had been quietly reorganizing itself around that understanding the way water finds the shape of its container. He didn't know who sent the books. He thought about it, turned it over, checked the handwriting against every adult he encountered. He came up with nothing. The handwriting was feminine, controlled, with a slight backward slant that suggested left-handed or trained to write right-handed against preference. The paper was high quality. The books themselves were either old and genuinely rare or new and not available through any channels Harry could access, which meant someone with reach was choosing them specifically for him. He decided, eventually, that it didn't matter who. What mattered was the books existed and they were his and they were teaching him things. What they were teaching him, primarily, was that what he was doing was not supposed to be possible. Wandless magic, unassisted, instinctive, self-directed magical expression, was documented in the books as a theoretical extreme. Something that existed in historical accounts and in the abilities of very young children before formal training, but not in older children, not in this form, not with this degree of intentionality. The stopped glass had not been a fluke. The warm cupboard wall had not been imagination. The way the library books fell open to the right page was not coincidence. He was 9 years old and doing things wandlessly that the books said trained adult witches and wizards found difficult with a wand. The anonymous journal, which he'd started thinking of as the Grey Journal because the cover was a soft ash color, was the most useful for this. Its author had documented 12 cases of what they called bonded magical amplification, which was the phenomenon of a person's magic being stabilized, deepened, and accelerated by proximity to or connection with an external magical source of significant age or power. The cases were historical, most of them, documented through secondary sources, pieced together from family records and ministry archives. In 11 of the 12 cases, the person experiencing the amplification had no idea it was happening. Harry read that passage 3 times. Then he lay on his back on the camp bed and stared at the underside of the stairs, which he could just barely make out in the torchlight, and thought very carefully about a gray afternoon when he was 5 years old. He remembered the market. He remembered the caramel, still warm, the blood-orange taste of it. He remembered the woman, Narcissa, constellation name, the one who'd said his aunt sounded exhausting, the one who'd looked at him instead of at the scar. He remembered the kiss, 2 seconds, unremarkable in execution, and the light that had come on in a room he hadn't known existed. The Grey Journal described the activation of bonded amplification as follows: subjects report a sudden interior clarity, as of a lamp being lit in a previously dark room. This is followed by a stabilization of ambient magical expression, a reduction in accidental incidents, and over time, a deepening of intentional magical capacity that outpaces what standard development would produce. His torch flickered. He encouraged it, gently, from habit, and it steadied. He thought, she didn't know she was doing it. Not as an accusation. As an observation. She'd kissed him the way you kiss a child when something in you moves before your mind catches up, and she'd walked away, and she probably hadn't thought about it since. He thought, but whoever is sending the books knows. Which meant someone was paying attention. He closed the Grey Journal and tucked it back behind the skirting board alongside the others, and when he went to sleep the cupboard was warm and the warmth had the same quality it always had, specific, steady, the opposite of accidental. School was navigable, which was the most generous thing Harry could say about it. He was not, technically, supposed to be doing well at school. This had been made clear to him by Vernon in the first week of Year 3, that doing better than Dudley would have consequences, and that standing out in any direction was unwelcome. He'd spent Year 3 and Year 4 operating in a careful middle ground, enough to pass, not enough to attract attention, which had been frustrating in a low-grade persistent way that he'd filed alongside the jumper and the glasses and the cupboard as simply the texture of his situation. Year 5, at 9, he found he could no longer maintain the pretense. Not because he'd stopped caring about the consequences. He'd simply become, by September of that year, too good at thinking to turn it off convincingly. The books had done something to his mind, or rather, they'd given his mind the tools it had apparently been waiting for, and now it moved faster than he could manage it into deliberate slowness. He answered questions before he'd finished deciding to answer them. He read passages assigned for the week in 20 minutes and spent the rest of the time reading things he'd brought from the skirting board hollow, hidden inside the textbook. His teacher, Mrs. Abrams, noticed him in the way teachers notice a student who doesn't fit their existing model. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had been teaching Year 5 for 16 years, and she had a very particular expression she deployed when something required further investigation. She used it on Harry in October. "You're reading something else," she said, not accusatory, just precise. She'd materialized at his elbow between one breath and the next, the particular skill of veteran teachers. He looked up at her. The non-textbook was already tucked under the desk, a reflex so practiced it was automatic. "Sorry, Mrs. Abrams." "Show me." He showed her. It was practical magical theory, not one of the more overtly unusual ones. Without knowing what it was, it looked like any dense academic text, dry presentation, no illustrations, technical language. She turned it over in her hands. "This is well above Year 5 level." "I know. Where did you get it?" "Someone sent it to me." She looked at him for a long moment, not at the scar, not with the specific careful blankness that adults who knew his history sometimes produced, but at him, the way very few people did. He noted this. He'd become precise about it. "Is someone teaching you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not exactly. I just read." She handed the book back. Her expression had shifted from investigation to something more complicated. She said, "I'm going to put you in the advanced reading group next term. You don't have to do Year 5 English anymore, provided your other work maintains." He thanked her. He did not tell her that her advanced reading group would be covering material he'd finished in July, but that wasn't her fault and it wasn't a problem he needed her to solve. What she gave him was time. Time in the school library while the rest of the class covered things he'd already absorbed, and the school librarian, Mr. Perkins, who had approximately zero interest in what a 9-year-old was reading as long as he was reading quietly and not damaging anything, which meant Harry could read whatever he liked for 40 minutes every Tuesday and Thursday, and what he liked was everything. He read through the magical theory books again with more comprehension the second time. He read the Muggle science books, physics, chemistry, the ones that described how the world worked at a fundamental level, and found that some of what they described aligned more closely with what the magical theory texts said than either side would likely have found comfortable. He read mythology, history, everything. He read with the specific hunger of a person who has been underfed for a long time and has just found the kitchen door unlocked. The school library didn't have many books he hadn't already read by November. Mr. Perkins, who was not unobservant despite appearances, found him sitting at the library table one Tuesday staring at the shelves with an expression that he'd correctly identified as the look of someone who has run out of road. "Finished?" Perkins said. "The ones I haven't read are the ones I already read," Harry said. "Mostly." Perkins considered him. He was a large, comfortable man who'd spent 30 years surrounded by books and had developed a fairly good sense of what a reader was versus what a person going through the motions of reading was, and this child was the former in a way that was almost alarming in someone his age. "There's a public library on Henley Street," he said. 3 bus stops. "Do you have a card?" "No." "I'll write you a letter." He said it the way he said most things, as a matter of information, not generosity, which was probably why it worked. "Take it on Saturday morning. Mrs. Diallo runs the children's section, but the adult section is unstaffed most of the day. Don't let her see you taking things from the adult stacks." Harry looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you've read everything I have," Perkins said, "and that's not supposed to be possible for a 9-year-old, and I don't know what to do with you, but I know what happens to children like you when no one does anything." He went back to his desk. "Saturday morning. The letter will be ready Friday." Harry went to the public library every Saturday for the next 3 months. He was also, during this period, getting into fewer accidents than he used to. This was the wrong framing, technically, but it was how the Dursleys framed it, and he'd adopted their language out of convenience. The incidents, the stopped glass, the spontaneous warmth, the book pages opening correctly, these weren't accidents. He understood that now. They were magic responding to his emotional state or his intention, and the more he read and the more he practiced the small intentional workings, the more he was able to modulate the response. The magic was learning to listen to him, or he was learning to ask it clearly, or both. The distinction felt philosophical. What mattered practically was that living with the Dursleys was becoming easier in the way that a problem becomes easier when you found its mechanism. Vernon couldn't make him feel small anymore. That had been true since he was 5, since the cupboard stopped being cold. But now he understood why. The bond in him, the thing the Grey Journal called bonded magical amplification, had stabilized his core sense of self in a way that Vernon's particular brand of emotional violence simply didn't reach. Vernon's words landed and were assessed and were rejected on their merits, which was to say they had no merits, and so they had no effect. Petunia was more complicated. Petunia occasionally looked at him with something that was neither hatred nor love but a kind of terrible grief, and Harry had read enough to understand that her grief was for her sister and that he was a reminder she hadn't asked for and couldn't send away. He didn't like Petunia. He wasn't required to. But he understood her, which was different. Dudley was simply Dudley, a large, comfortable child who had never been told no about anything and was suffering the predictable consequences of that in his personality. Harry's magic had, on 2 occasions, responded to Dudley's physical bullying with enough passive force to make Dudley back off, and after the second time Dudley had, with the pragmatic assessment of a child who doesn't like losing, quietly stopped. The gang still occasionally had a go, but without Dudley it was disorganized and Harry had gotten fast. He was living the same life he'd always lived, technically. Same cupboard, same bread ends and water when he'd done something wrong, same Christmas watching through the crack. But the quality of the life had changed entirely, because he had changed, and when you change what you are then what you experience changes with you even if the external facts remain identical. He thought about this sometimes. About how much of suffering was about what you were convinced you deserved. The books had given him the language for the conviction and had then systematically dismantled it, chapter by chapter, theory by theory. He had come out the other side of that process into something that felt less like peace and more like clarity. He knew what he was. He knew what he wasn't. He knew that the Dursleys' opinion of him was not a fact about Harry Potter but a fact about the Dursleys. He was 9 years old and he was not at peace with his situation, but he was not broken by it, which was not an accident and was not luck. Whoever sent the books had done something for him that he doubted they fully understood. 3 miles and one very different world away, Narcissa Malfoy stood in the library of Malfoy Manor and looked at the gap on the shelf where 11 books used to be. She'd been doing this for 4 years now, curating the selections, acquiring the ones that required acquiring, writing out the address each time in her less dominant hand because the handwriting needed to be unrecognizable and she needed the act of writing it to feel deliberate and considered rather than automatic. She made each selection carefully. She thought about what a child of his age and his demonstrated magical capacity would need to understand next. She sourced books that weren't available through standard channels through her account at Obscurus Books, paying in cash through a proxy account she'd established for exactly this purpose. She had never sent a note. She didn't know what she would say. Lucius was in France this week, managing a property dispute that had been grinding through the French ministry for 2 years and required his personal presence. Draco was with his tutor, which meant the manor was as quiet as it got, which was not particularly quiet. Old houses always had their own language of settlings and creaks and the ambient hum of generations of accumulated magic, but it was quiet enough that she could stand in the library and look at the empty shelf spaces and think without being interrupted. She had the grey journal for another week. She'd borrowed it from Cordelia Selwyn's private collection on the pretext of research, and she needed to return it before Cordelia noticed, but she'd spent those 2 weeks going through it in detail with the specific focus she applied to things she needed to understand properly. She'd made notes, which she kept in a locked box in a location that Lucius's considerable intelligence and his habit of knowing where things were had not, so far, found. The journal confirmed what she'd suspected and then what she'd become progressively more certain of in the 4 years since the Undercroft market. She had activated an ancient magic binding. Not intentionally. Not with any understanding of what she was doing. But intent, the journal made clear, was not a prerequisite for ancient magic. It predated the concept, the same way weather predated umbrellas. Ancient magic responded to truth, not intention. Something in her had recognized something in him, and the act of the kiss, an act of genuine and unperformed care, had been enough of a true thing to trigger a response from a layer of magic old enough not to need spells or wands or any of the formal architecture that wizarding society had built around it. She'd amplified him. She'd stabilized him. And this was the part that she read 4 times and then had to put the journal down and look out the window, she'd marked him. Not in a harmful way. The journal was clear about this. A living enchantment, the kind that grew from genuine connection, was protective in its nature. It couldn't be used against its subject. It was not control or possession. It was more like, and the journal author struggled here, using several different metaphors before settling on one, it was more like a frequency. She'd set a frequency in him, and his magic had attuned to it, and now it would always recognize her and what she represented in him, and because it recognized her it would, on some level, protect that space. Hold it clear. She had read the next part sitting very still. In cases of strong bonded amplification, the subject's magic demonstrates a notable, and to this author's knowledge permanent, resistance to other connections attempting to occupy the same role. The bond, once formed, is exclusive in its primary function. This is not behavioral restriction in any conventional sense. The subject may form all ordinary connections. But the deep attunement will respond only to its original source, and attempts by other individuals to fill that specific role will find the ground, as it were, already occupied. She'd sat with that for a long time. She was thinking about it now, standing in front of the empty shelf spaces with one hand resting lightly on the wood. She did not have a framework for what this made them to each other. The journal didn't either, really. It was a historical and theoretical text, not a guide to navigating a situation. What she had was a set of facts and the obligation to do something responsible with them. She had, so far, sent books. This was responsible. This was useful. She was giving him tools without inserting herself into his life in a way that would be, she searched for the right word and landed on complicated. His life was already complicated. He was Harry Potter, orphan, living with muggles who she was increasingly certain were not providing adequately for him. Adding Narcissa Malfoy, wife of a known former Death Eater, to his complications would not be a net positive. She sent books instead. She thought about the quality of his eyes when she'd crouched down to his level. The way he'd held out his hand. She thought about him reading, because the books she sent had a very faint trace enchantment, barely anything, just enough to tell her when they were being opened, a warmth in her palms that lasted a few seconds. She felt it at irregular intervals throughout each week, and she had over 4 years developed a strong sense of his reading patterns. He read intensely for long stretches and then not at all, which suggested uninterrupted reading time was something he had to take rather than something given to him. She felt the trace now, faintly, standing in the library. The gray journal, warm in her palm. He was reading it again. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she went to her writing desk, opened the locked box, and added to her notes, Volume 1 of Ollivander's Pre-Wand Magical History. Properties of Living Magic, Marchetti. The Annotated Laws of Magical Inheritance. Books he was ready for now. Books that would start moving him toward understanding his own situation. She would find them this week. She wrote out the address in her non-dominant hand, Harry Potter, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The handwriting still looked like no one she knew. She'd been practicing it for 4 years. She sealed the list, put it back in the box, and went to dress for dinner. The 12th book arrived in January of Harry's year 5. He unwrapped it in the cupboard, torch in hand, and the title stopped him, The Annotated Laws of Magical Inheritance, Rights, Bonds, and Ancient Claims. He sat with it in his lap for a moment. Then he opened to the index. Bonded Amplification, c. pages 112 to 119, 203 to 207, 441 to 448. Living Enchantments, pages 78 to 89. Ancient Magic, Formation of, pages 14 to 31. Seal Bonds, Primary and Secondary, pages 204 to 207. He turned to page 204. A seal bond formed through an act of genuine magical intent, whether conscious or otherwise, carries the legal and magical status of a primary bond when the bonding party demonstrates sufficient magical depth and the subject demonstrates receptivity consistent with prior magical marking. In the case of Harry James Potter, publicly documented as the recipient of Lily Potter's sacrificial seal, any subsequent bonding carries the legal status of a secondary seal and the protective authority of an ancient claim. Such a claim, once established, is recognized by the Ministry of Magic as a matter of formal record, whether or not either party has registered it formally. He stopped. He read it again. He flipped back to page 112. He read for 4 hours, until the torch began to dim and his fingers were cramped from holding the book, and when he finished he lay back on the camp bed and looked at the dark above him. There was a woman, constellation name, gray afternoon, blood orange caramel warm in his mouth, who had kissed his forehead when he was 5 years old and accidentally bonded herself to him with an ancient magic that predated the ministry and outranked nearly every other form of magical law on record. She had done it without knowing what she was doing. She had probably gone home and not thought about it again. And yet, the books. 12 of them, over 4 years, curated with a precision that suggested someone who knew what he needed and was choosing carefully. No notes. No name. But the handwriting was always the same, and the books built on each other with a logical progression that wasn't random, and whoever was sending them understood magical theory at a level that was not casual. He thought about what page 207 said, the bonding party, regardless of intent at the time of formation, will typically experience the bond as a persistent awareness of the subject's well-being, a sensitivity to distress that cannot be suppressed by will or potions, and in cases of strong formation, an inability to fully disengage attention from the subject over time. He thought, she's been paying attention for 4 years. He thought, she just doesn't know I know. The torch gave out. He sat in the warm dark of the cupboard, turning this over, and for the first time since he was 5 years old he felt something other than the quiet, steady, enoughness of the warmth. He felt something sharper, brighter, almost like anticipation. He was going to Hogwarts in 2 years. She had sent him 12 books to prepare him. Whoever she was, whatever her name was, she was watching. She was choosing. She was making decisions about his education with a care that no one else in his life had ever applied, and she was doing it from a distance with no credit and no thanks and no expectation of either. He pressed his hand to the warm wall. The wall, as always, was warm. He thought, I know you're there. Not aloud. It wasn't a statement for anyone else. Just an accounting, the same careful accounting he applied to everything, updated with new information. He thought, I'm not afraid of anything you are. Whatever that is. In a locked box in Malfoy Manor, a woman with a non-dominant handwriting and a sensitivity to magic she'd spent 30 years cultivating felt something she could only describe as a knock, a specific, precise warmth in her palms that was different from the reading trace, more deliberate, more directed, and set down her quill and pressed both hands flat to her desk. She stayed like that for a long moment, head bowed, breath careful. Then she wrote down the next 3 book titles, sealed the envelope, and went to bed. School ended in July and Harry turned 10 in August, and on the morning of his birthday, which the Dursleys did not acknowledge in any form, he woke up in the cupboard and the warmth was brighter than it had ever been. Not warmer in temperature. Brighter in quality, a richness, an intensity, like the difference between a candle and a lamp. He lay still for a moment, breathing it in. Then he reached under the camp bed, retrieved the loose floorboard he'd found earlier that year, better hiding than the skirting board, less accessible, and took out his notebook. Not a school notebook. A plain black one from the Oxfam shop on the high street, purchased with money he'd found in Dudley's old jacket when Petunia had told him to sort through the donations bag. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote, in careful neat letters, "Things I know. My mother's magic is a seal. Protection through sacrifice." A second seal was added when I was 5. Different in type. Same in nature, genuine, unperformed, ancient. The second seal amplifies the first. The two together are, the book uses the phrase, catastrophically rare. I think I understand why. Someone sends me books. 12 so far. She knows what she's doing. She knows what I am. I don't know her name, but I know her handwriting. She kissed my forehead in a market when I was 5 years old, and I think she knew something was different, but I don't think she knew what. I'm going to find out who she is. And then I'm going to figure out what comes next. He closed the notebook, replaced it under the floorboard, and went upstairs to make the Dursleys breakfast. The warmth went with him, of course. It always did. He was 10 years old, undersized and underfed and sleeping in a cupboard, wearing a jumper with a burn hole in the collar, and he was not afraid of anything that was coming for him. Something in the deep architecture of the universe had decided, on a grey afternoon in a market that smelled like rain and burned sugar, to keep him. And he had decided, on the morning of his 10th birthday in a warm cupboard on Privet Drive, to keep it back. Chapter 3. The sorting doesn't lie. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not through the front door slot. Not delivered by a postman or even dropped discreetly on the doorstep. It came through the kitchen window at 7 in the morning while Harry was frying eggs, carried by an owl that looked insufferably pleased with itself, and it landed directly on top of the frying pan's handle with a precision that suggested magical guidance. Vernon, who was at the kitchen table with his newspaper, went the color of old beetroot. Harry picked up the letter. Set the eggs off the heat. Read his name on the envelope, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, and felt something settle in his chest like the final piece of a thing clicking into place. Give that here, Vernon said. No, Harry said. The kitchen went very quiet. In 4 years of increasingly non-functional attempted domination, Vernon had never successfully reclaimed the territory he'd lost the night the glass stopped in mid-air, but he tried periodically, the way a man tries a door he knows is locked just to confirm it's still locked. This was one of those moments. He was out of his chair and across the kitchen with impressive speed for a man of his dimensions, hand out, face doing the specific thing it did when he was genuinely furious rather than performatively furious. Harry looked at him steadily and opened the letter. Vernon's hand stopped 6 inches from the envelope. Not because of anything visible. Because of the quality of Harry's expression, which had exactly the same effect as a wall, not threatening, not aggressive, simply present and entirely immovable. Vernon was not a subtle man, but he was not a complete idiot either, and something in the particular stillness of this 11-year-old told him, at a level below language, that the landscape had changed. He went back to his chair. Petunia, in the doorway, had gone very white. Harry read the letter. Then he ate his breakfast standing at the counter, tucked the letter in the back pocket of his jeans, and went upstairs to Dudley's second bedroom to look at his things. He had accumulated, over 5 years of careful resource management, a small but specific collection of things the Dursleys didn't know about. The notebook, 3 of them now, the black one and 2 replacements. The books, still behind the revised floorboard system. A small amount of money, less than £20 but more than nothing, from Dudley's discarded jacket pockets and the Oxfam change bin, and one occasion when Petunia had left her purse unattended during a row with Vernon. A photograph of a woman with red hair and green eyes that Mrs. Figg had given him in September, with the particular careful look of someone doing something they've been waiting to do for a long time. She hadn't explained where she got it and he hadn't asked. He looked at the photograph now. His mother looked back at him, young, laughing, holding something off camera that she found funny. The green of her eyes was the same green he saw in every reflective surface. He'd spent time with this photograph, turning it over, looking for whatever the books described as the magical signature of a sacrificial seal. He couldn't see it. But he could feel it, the same way he could feel the warmth in the cupboard, the shape of someone's love arranged around him like architecture. "I'm going," he told the photograph. Not to her, specifically. To himself, with her as witness. "I've been ready for 2 years. He put the photograph in the notebook in the bottom of the bag he'd been packing in his head for months, and went back downstairs to tell the Dursleys he'd be leaving at the end of August. Diagon Alley at the end of August was nothing like the Undercroft Market. Harry stood in it for a full 30 seconds on arrival and just looked. He'd come through the leaky cauldron on his own, following the instructions in the Hogwarts letter with the map he'd drawn from memory after reading a concise history of magical Britain's commercial centres in April. He had the money from his vault, and the vault had been a revelation, because Gringotts was everything the book said it was and the goblins were everything the book said they were, and his vault was not empty, which meant there were people who had arranged for him not to be destitute, and he had thoughts about who. He bought his books first, because the books were the thing. Flourish and blots took 40 minutes and he came out with everything on the list and 3 things not on the list that he'd found in the back section the assistant described as advanced. Most students don't touch them until 6th year. He thanked her and paid for them without mentioning that he'd been working at 6th year level since he was 9. Robes at Madame Malkin's. Telescope, brass scales, potions equipment. He handled the shopping with the systematic efficiency of someone who had planned it and knew exactly what they were doing, which was true, and the side effect of this was that the various shop assistants who typically enjoyed being helpful to first years found themselves with relatively little to do in his vicinity. He was in the wand shop last. Ollivander's was dimly lit and smelled like wood shavings and the particular dry magic of old things, and Ollivander himself materialized from the back of the shop the way people only materialize when they know exactly where they're going and the path is entirely internal. He looked at Harry with silver eyes that were evaluating something Harry couldn't quite identify. "Harry Potter," Ollivander said, and it wasn't a greeting. "Yes," Harry said. "I remember every wand I've sold, Mr. Potter. I sold your father a wand, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable. Excellent for transfiguration. And your mother, willow, 10¼ inches, swishy. Very good for charms." He paused. "You have her eyes." "So I'm told," Harry said. Ollivander's silver gaze moved over him with the quality of a very good diagnostic, taking something in that wasn't visible. "Hold out your wand arm." He tried 7 wands. Each one, when Harry held it, produced a response that Ollivander observed with increasing stillness, not the explosion of sparks that Harry understood was the positive result, but something more contained, as though the wand was responding but not fully committing. By the 7th, Ollivander was standing very straight and very quiet. "Interesting," he said, mostly to himself. He disappeared into the back and came out with a long, slim box. "Holly," he said, 11 inches. Phoenix feather core. The phoenix in question gave only 2 feathers. He paused, holding Harry's gaze. "Its other feather is in the wand that gave you that scar." Harry took the wand. The warmth that came was not the warmth from the cupboard. It was brighter and wider and moved up his arm and through his chest, and for a moment the whole shop smelled like something burning and the dust on every surface rose 6 inches and then settled. Gold sparks cascaded from the tip, long and bright, and somewhere in the back of Harry's awareness the magic that lived in him, deep and structured and nothing like what formal magical education apparently expected, reached toward the wand the way you reach toward something that was always yours. Ollivander was looking at him with an expression that had gone beyond professional assessment into something more personal. "Curious," he said softly. "Very curious. The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter, and I have learned in 70 years of this work to trust the choice. But I've never felt a pairing quite like this." He tilted his head. "You've been using magic without a wand." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harry said. "For how long?" "Since I was 6. Intentionally. Before that it was accidental." Ollivander was quiet for a moment. "The wand will feel like an extension of something that already exists. Not a tool so much as an amplifier." He paused again. "I suspect you already knew that." "I suspected," Harry said. 7 galleons, Ollivander said, and then, as Harry turned to go, "Mr. Potter. The 2 feathers from that phoenix, the connection between the wands will matter. But it is not the most significant magical connection you carry." He held his gaze. "I think you know that too." "Yes," Harry said. "I do." He walked out into the August sunshine with the wand in his hand and the warmth in his chest, and Diagon Alley moved around him in all its noise and color, and he felt, for the first time outside his own cupboard, entirely at home. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. He found a compartment near the back, put his trunk up, and sat down with one of the non-required books open in his lap. He expected to be left alone, which was fine. Solitude had been the primary texture of his social life and he was comfortable in it. The door opened 20 minutes out of London and a girl with very large hair and a very focused expression came in, saw that the compartment was occupied, and said, "Is anyone sitting? Sorry, is this compartment free?" "I mean the other seats, obviously someone's sitting there, which is you. Sit down," Harry said, not unkindly. "It's fine." She sat, arranged an enormous amount of books on the seat beside her, and then noticed what he was reading. Her expression, which had been doing several things at once, went very still. "That's not on the first-year list," she said. "No. That's the annotated edition of Bathilda Bagshot. With the original source citations." "Yes." She looked at him with the expression of someone revising their initial categorization. "I'm Hermione Granger." "Harry Potter." She'd heard of him, clearly. The eyes moved to the scar and then back to his face with the practiced speed of someone who'd already decided not to make it a thing, which he appreciated. "I've read a history of magic and most of the standard texts." "Have you read Bagshot's other work?" "The Wizarding History of Britain is actually more comprehensive than the one on our list. The abridged edition loses several chapters about the Goblin Wars entirely. I have the full edition," Harry said. "The Goblin Wars chapters are better in Morlock's Century of Blood if you want more primary source material. Bagshot's politics make her unreliable on the goblins specifically." Hermione stared at him. Then, with the expression of someone who has spent 11 years being the most prepared person in every room and has just met someone who prepared differently but possibly more, "Can I see your book list?" "Not the official one. What you've actually read." He told her. She got out a notebook. He was 3 books into it before she held up a hand and said, "Wait, how? How did you read all of this? Where did you get them?" "Someone sent them to me," he said. "Who?" "I don't know yet," he said. I have a theory. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who needs all the information immediately and is physically restraining the impulse to demand it. You're going to be insufferable, she said. Probably, Harry agreed. Are you? A pause. Then, with complete honesty, yes. I'm told it's my defining characteristic. Good, Harry said. I find insufferable people easier to talk to. They don't do the thing. What thing? The thing where they pretend to understand something they don't. Or pretend not to understand something they do. Hermione considered this. I do that sometimes. When I'm nervous. You're not nervous now. No, she said, with some surprise, as though she'd just noticed. I'm not. The train ran on through the English countryside, and they talked for 6 hours without stopping. He found Ron Weasley an hour out of London, or rather, Ron found the compartment, because every other one was apparently full, and arrived with a smudge on his nose and an open, uncomplicated face and immediately, without any apparent consideration, sat down and offered Harry half of what looked like an entire bakery's worth of sandwiches. Harry accepted without ceremony. Ron watched him eat with the satisfied expression of someone who has identified a need and met it without making it a whole thing. You're Harry Potter, Ron said. My mum pointed you out on the platform. Yes. My brothers said the sorting's terrifying, Ron said, apparently less concerned about Harry's famous status than about this more immediate problem. Fred said it involves a fight with a troll. Fred's winding you up, Harry said. It's a hat. A hat? An enchanted hat. It reads your mind and places you in a house. Ron absorbed this. That's either better or worse than a troll, I can't decide. Depends what's in your mind, Hermione said, without looking up from the book she'd borrowed from Harry. Ron looked at her. What's in yours? Nothing I'm concerned about, she said. Terrifying, Ron said, but he was grinning, and Harry found he was grinning too, which was not something he had much practice with in the presence of other people, and it felt more natural than he expected. Hogwarts at night was everything the books described and nothing like what the books described, because you cannot describe scale in text and do it justice, and you cannot describe the way magic accumulates in old stone until you are standing in the entrance hall of a 1,000-year-old school and feeling it on your skin like weather. Harry stood in the queue of first years and felt the castle breathe around him and thought, yes. This is where it was always pointing. Professor McGonagall walked them through the procedure with the crisp efficiency of someone who has explained this many times and sees no reason to embellish it. The sorting hat. The 4 houses. One at a time, alphabetically, you sat on the stool and it looked at your mind and told you where you belonged. They went into the great hall in a cluster and Harry felt 400 pairs of eyes land on him the moment he stepped through the doors, and he looked back, steady and unhurried, scanning the tables with a cataloging attention that was by now entirely automatic. 4 houses, 4 tables. The staff table at the front with Dumbledore at its center, white-bearded, twinkling-eyed, exactly as described in the portraits and in the books, who met Harry's gaze and held it for a moment with an expression that Harry catalogued as surprised and filed under interesting. He looked at Dumbledore the way he looked at everyone, clearly, without particular deference, without the reverence that the rest of the first years were radiating toward the headmaster like a collective emanation. Whatever Dumbledore read in Harry's expression made the twinkle in his eyes do something more complicated than twinkle. Harry looked away first. Not quickly. Just because he'd seen what he needed to see. The sorting went alphabetically. Hermione went before him, Gryffindor, within 30 seconds, the hat barely seeming to deliberate, and she walked to the table with her chin up and relief written all over her face, which she would have been mortified to know was visible. Ron was Gryffindor too. 3rd generation, the hat barely touching his head. Potter, Harry. The murmur that went through the hall was the specific murmur he'd been expecting, the 2-syllable recognition, the secondary murmur rippling out from it. He walked to the stool, sat down, and the hat descended over his eyes and the world went dark. Well, said the hat. It didn't speak the way voices spoke. It was more like thought arriving in a different accent. I've been waiting for this one. They told me you were coming, you know. Not in so many words. But a school as old as this one feels things. Harry didn't respond. He waited. Let me see, yes. Yes, that's interesting. You're very sure of yourself for 11. Not arrogance, I've seen arrogance, I've put rather a lot of it in Slytherin over the years. This is something else. This is certainty that's been tested. Built from the ground up. A pause that felt like the hat riffling through files. 2 seals. Remarkable. I haven't felt a double seal since, well, a very long time. You'd know about that, Harry thought back. Yes. I'd know about a great many things. Something that might have been warmth. You could be in Slytherin. I mean that as a genuine observation, not a threat. The strategic intelligence, the self-possession, the instinct for leverage, those belong in Slytherin by standard measure. And there are arguments for the power base. I know, Harry thought. But it's not where I'm going. No, the hat agreed, with what sounded like satisfaction. It isn't. Because underneath the strategy there's something else driving it. The intelligence is in service of something, and the thing it serves is loyalty. Specific, chosen, irreversible loyalty. You love people very precisely, Mr. Potter, and you'll burn everything down before you let them be hurt. A beat. That's Gryffindor. That's always been Gryffindor. Then put me there. One more thing, the hat said, and its tone changed slightly, less assessor, more keeper of records. The bond you carry. The second one. I want you to know that I can feel it even here, at this distance, and it is, I have no other word for it, it is extraordinary. Whatever was intended or unintended about its formation, the thing itself is not casual. You understand that already? Yes. Good. And then, aloud, in the voice that carried across the great hall, Gryffindor. The table erupted. Harry pulled the hat off and handed it to McGonagall, who had an expression that suggested she had anticipated a longer deliberation and had feelings about having anticipated wrongly. He walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down next to Hermione, and the cheering rolled over him like water, and across the hall at the Slytherin table a pale-haired boy was watching him with narrowed silver eyes and an expression that was not quite any of the things Harry expected. Draco Malfoy had been sorted into Slytherin without the hat touching his head. He'd pulled it on, and before he'd even settled on the stool it had shouted Slytherin with the cheerful confidence of something that has found an obvious answer, and he'd walked to his table with the satisfaction of a boy who has never doubted where he belongs. He had spent approximately 45 seconds being satisfied before Harry Potter sat on the stool. He didn't know what he'd expected from the famous Potter. Some version of the stories, probably, the savior, the symbol, the boy who defeated the Dark Lord as a baby and presumably spent his subsequent years being celebrated accordingly. He'd expected soft. He'd expected odd. He'd expected someone who needed the fame because they had nothing else. What he'd gotten was someone who walked into the great hall and scanned it like a general reviewing terrain. And then looked at his father's old associate Dumbledore the way you look at a variable you haven't fully solved yet, without the slightest suggestion that the most powerful wizard in Britain ought to inspire any feeling other than analytical interest. And then sat on the sorting stool, and the hat spent 4 minutes on his head. Draco had been counting, because the hat barely touched most people's hair before deciding, and 4 full minutes was not normal and everyone in the hall knew it wasn't normal, before placing him in Gryffindor. Draco had spent the rest of the sorting watching Harry Potter settle into his seat, accept what appeared to be an enormous amount of food from the red-haired Weasley with the equanimity of someone who's been underfed and intends to do something about it, say something to the Granger girl that made her laugh with the surprise of someone not used to being made to laugh, and never once look toward the Slytherin table. This was, Draco decided, the most irritating thing about him. Not the fame. Not the scar. The simple fact that Harry Potter was absolutely, entirely indifferent to whether or not Draco Malfoy existed. He thought about his mother. She had looked different this summer. Not unhappy, not exactly, nothing so legible as that. Just thoughtful, in a way that she mostly wasn't, in a way that had nothing to do with anything happening in their household. He'd caught her at her writing desk on 3 separate occasions with her non-dominant hand, which she only used when she was writing something she considered private. He'd asked her once what she was writing and she'd said correspondence, with a smile that was entirely genuine and entirely uninformative, which was one of his mother's particular skills. He'd tried to tell her, this summer, that he intended to befriend Harry Potter. She'd set her quill down carefully and looked at him with an expression he couldn't classify, and then said, "Don't force it, Draco. Some connections decide themselves." He hadn't known what to do with that. He knew his mother moved in dimensions he didn't fully see. She was the most intelligent person in his life and also the most private, and the combination meant there were entire landscapes of her that he'd been navigating around since he was old enough to notice they were there. He trusted her instincts in the abstract. He didn't always have the information to understand them. He watched Harry Potter eat with the methodical appreciation of someone for whom good food was not a given, and something in Draco's chest did something uncomfortable and unspecific, and he looked away. The castle settled around its new students over the first 2 weeks in the way that old places settle, incrementally, on its own terms, taking measurements. Harry learned the school the way he'd learned everything, systematically, from the inside out. He walked the corridors at 5 in the morning when the staircases were mostly empty and the portraits were asleep. He found passages the other first-years didn't know about because the books he'd read included Hogwarts, a history in its unabridged form, which had floor plans the library edition didn't contain. He mapped things. He noted things. He found the library's restricted section door could be opened without a pass if you applied a specific kind of pressure 3 inches above the lock, and he visited it twice before deciding that most of its contents were not as interesting as their reputation. He was excellent at charms and better at transfiguration than most of the third-years he'd seen practicing in the corridors. He was good at potions in the way that someone who has read the theory exhaustively is good at the practical component, not creatively, not yet, but precisely. Snape's class was interesting. Not for the reasons most of the first-years found it interesting, which was primarily because Snape was frightening in a way that made people want to both impress and avoid him simultaneously. Harry found it interesting because Snape looked at him with a specific hostility that was not what it appeared to be. Most hostility was about the person doing the looking. Snape's hostility at Harry had an extra dimension. It kept running into something softer underneath, something that looked like grief, and then overcorrecting back into hostility with what struck Harry as a lot of work. He had his own theory about Snape. He didn't share it. He simply did his work, answered questions correctly when called on, and looked at Snape with the clear-eyed steadiness he applied to everything, which he noticed made Snape deeply uncomfortable, which was not something he minded. Hermione was his closest friend within 2 weeks. This seemed to surprise her more than it surprised him. She was the only person his age whose mind moved at a comparable pace, and the experience of being in intellectual company for the first time in his life was something he chose not to examine too closely because the alternative was feeling the full weight of what had been missing for 11 years, and he was storing that for later. Ron was his friend in a different way, easier, less like a meeting of equals and more like a comfortable room you didn't have to explain yourself in. Ron's instincts were good even when his reasoning was sloppy, and he had a directness that Harry found restful. He said what he thought. He offered food. He was loyal in the uncomplicated, structural way that the Sorting Hat had called Gryffindor's core. Draco Malfoy appeared at his elbow on the Thursday of the second week. Harry was in the library, alone, with 3 books open simultaneously and a 4th in his hand, and he heard the approach before it arrived, the specific footstep pattern of someone who learned to walk in formal shoes on marble floors and had never fully adjusted to anything else. "Potter," Draco said. Harry looked up. "Malfoy." Draco sat down across from him without being invited, which Harry noted as either confidence or the assumption that invitation was not required. He had his father's coloring, pale, silver-eyed, sharp-featured, but his mother's something else underneath. Harry knew this about him before he could have articulated how, the same way he knew things that came from the bond's particular frequency. "You were on the stool for 4 minutes, Draco said. "I know. What did it say to you?" "What did yours say to you?" Harry said. A pause. "Mine didn't say anything. It was immediate." "That must be nice," Harry said, and went back to his book. Draco was quiet for a moment, which Harry identified as someone recalibrating. He'd come in with a script and the script wasn't running. "My mother mentioned you once," Draco said. Not casually. With the precision of someone placing a piece on a board. Harry looked up again. Slower this time. "She said some connections decide themselves," Draco said, watching him. "She said it about you specifically." "When?" "This summer." He paused. "She doesn't explain herself. She never has. But she said it like it was, factual. Not advice. Just something she knew." Harry held his gaze and felt the bond hum in his chest like a plucked string. "Your mother's name," he said carefully. "Is she Narcissa?" "Narcissa Black originally, married Malfoy?" Something moved across Draco's face, not surprise, but the specific expression of someone receiving a confirmation of something they'd half suspected. "Yes." "Constellation name," Harry said quietly. "She named me after a star," Draco said, which was not a response but was clearly a language they were both speaking now, the language of things understood without being said. Harry looked at him for a long moment. This was the son of the woman who had kissed his forehead in a market and accidentally bonded herself to him with an ancient magic old enough to predate the school they were sitting in. This was the boy whose mother had sent him 12 books and was probably, at this very moment, selecting the 13th. He thought about what the Sorting Hat had said. Some connections decide themselves. "Your mother is very intelligent," Harry said. Draco blinked. Of all the responses available, this was clearly not in his top 10. "Yes," he said, after a beat. "She is." "I believe that," Harry said. And then, because it was true and because Draco deserved at least the edge of the real thing even if the whole of it wasn't Harry's to give yet, "I think we're going to be important to each other. I don't know exactly what shape that takes yet." Draco stared at him. "That's probably not the conversation you came to have," Harry said. "No," Draco agreed, slowly. "Not even close." "Sit down," Harry said. He was already sitting, but it was an invitation this time rather than a tolerance of presence. "I'll tell you what the hat said to me. You tell me what you know about ancient magic bonds." "I know some," Draco said, settling into the chair properly. "My mother's library is comprehensive." "I know," Harry said, which made Draco go still again. They stayed in the library until the librarian, Madame Pants, cleared them out at closing time, and the conversation went in directions neither of them had mapped, and by the time they walked back to their respective towers there was something between them that neither boy had language for but both had the sense to leave unnamed until it decided what it was. Other girls. This was a thing Harry noticed in October and understood by November. Not dramatically. Not with supernatural interference or visible signs. Simply, the girls in Gryffindor, in his year and the years above, interacted with him in ways that had a quality like a room with a closed door. Friendly. Sometimes warm. But not, reaching him, somehow. Not in the way that mattered. Parvati Patil was pretty and kind and clearly interested in the general concept of Harry Potter, and when she sat next to him in charms it was perfectly pleasant and also felt like talking to someone through glass. Lavender Brown had the same quality. He was not rude to them. He was not cold. He simply couldn't find the frequency, the specific attunement, and no amount of conversation seemed to locate it. He thought about what the gray journal said about the ground already being occupied. He thought about a woman with silver blonde hair crouching down to his level in a market and looking at him instead of at the scar. He wasn't 11 years old in the way 11-year-olds were supposed to be. He knew this. His experience of his own life had made him something older and more internally structured than his age should have allowed, and maybe that was why it was Hermione, specifically Hermione, who made genuine friendship possible, because she was also not quite what 11 was supposed to be. But the other thing, the thing that was specifically about the bond, he could feel it operating. Not invasive, not controlling. Just present. The way a compass needle points north regardless of where you aim it, it doesn't stop you from walking south, it just always tells you which direction north is. North, for Harry, had a very specific location. And it was not in Gryffindor Tower. He didn't think about this too much. He filed it alongside everything else he was learning about himself and what he was, and he studied and practiced and read and talked to Hermione and Ron and occasionally, in the library, talked to Draco Malfoy who was becoming something he couldn't yet name, and he grew. He was, by the end of November, visibly and measurably not the same person who had arrived at King's Cross in September, which could be said of most first years, but with Harry the change was less one of adaptation and more one of acceleration. He had been becoming something for 10 years. Hogwarts was not causing the change. It was giving it space. Dumbledore, Harry noticed, watched him a lot. Not obviously. Not the way Snape watched him, which was frontal and uncomfortable and clearly about something. Dumbledore watched him the way you watch a variable you need more data on. Calm, distant, methodical. Harry watched back when he could without appearing to, and what he saw was a man doing very careful calculations about something he hadn't fully understood yet. Harry was fine with that. He was doing the same. He had, by December, a very clear picture of what his year looked like. He had allies. He had intelligence. He had a bond that was operating on his behalf in ways that went significantly beyond a warm cupboard wall. He had the beginning of something with Draco Malfoy that was neither friendship nor rivalry but a third thing he suspected would matter more than either. And somewhere in Wizarding Britain, a woman with a locked box and a non-dominant handwriting was selecting his 13th book. He thought about that on the last night of term, watching snow fall past the dormitory window while the other boys slept, and he felt the warmth in his chest, same warmth, always the same warmth, the specific frequency of it as familiar now as his own heartbeat. 2 years, maybe 3, and he would find her. He wasn't in a hurry. The bond was permanent. She wasn't going anywhere. And neither, for the first time in his life, was he. Chapter 4, Lucius Plays His Hand. The diary arrived in September of second year inside Ginny Weasley's cauldron. Harry knew this because Ron told him at breakfast with the specific bewildered expression Ron wore when something had happened that he couldn't categorize, and because Harry had already noticed Ginny that morning. She'd been at the Gryffindor table for 20 minutes before anyone else arrived, writing in something small and black with the focused intensity of a person transcribing something important before they forgot it. He'd glanced at her and clocked it and moved on, the way he clocked everything, and then Ron had mentioned the diary and the two observations had connected with the particular snap of things that belonged together. He didn't say anything immediately. He ate his toast and thought about it. He'd come back to Hogwarts this year knowing 3 things that he hadn't known when he left. The first was that someone had modified his Hogwarts letter in the summer, the seal had been opened and repressed, badly, and whoever had done it had also intercepted 2 letters from Ron and Hermione that he'd never received. The second was that the book shipments had stopped. He'd waited through July and August and nothing had come, and the warmth in his chest had not dimmed but the external evidence of attention had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than neglectful. The third was a conversation with Draco at the Diagon Alley bookshop that had told him more than Draco probably intended. Draco had been with his father. Lucius Malfoy in person was everything the books and the social intelligence Harry had accumulated suggested he would be: tall, composed, the specific kind of handsome that comes from generations of careful breeding, and carrying himself with the weight of someone who has never once questioned whether a room belonged to him. He had silver-gray eyes like Draco's but colder, the warmth entirely absent from them, and he had looked at Harry with the precise evaluating gaze of someone doing a very fast and very thorough threat assessment. Harry had looked back. The encounter had lasted 40 seconds. Lucius had said something brittle and positioned about the fame of the boy who lived, and Harry had said nothing, because nothing was the correct response to an opening move designed to establish social hierarchy, and then Lucius had taken Draco's arm and moved him away with the smooth efficiency of a man removing a chess piece from a contested square. Draco had looked back once, with an expression that was apologetic and also, underneath, frightened, not of Harry, but of what Lucius would say afterward. Harry had catalogued this and added it to everything he was building about the Malfoy family dynamic, which was a structure with load-bearing walls in places that didn't look structural and cracks in places that appeared solid. He'd also noticed, in the bookshop, the way Lucius Malfoy's gaze had moved to Ginny Weasley when her father wasn't looking. The whispers started in October. Enemies of the heir, beware. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Painted in what appeared to be blood on the second-floor corridor wall, discovered by a group of third-years who arrived before a teacher and had the good sense to back away immediately. The cat, Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, had been found rigid and petrified below the message, alive but unmoving, her eyes turned to mirrors. The school moved through its familiar anxious patterns. Teachers in clusters. Students in whispers. Dumbledore's expression during breakfast the morning after carrying the specific weight of someone recalculating rather than discovering. Harry ate his breakfast and thought about the diary. He'd been thinking about it since September, turning it over in the way he turned over everything that didn't fully resolve. Ginny had been writing in it constantly. He saw her in common room corners, at library tables, at breakfast, always with the small black diary open and her quill moving with the focused urgency of someone in conversation. He'd asked Ron once, carefully, where she'd gotten it, and Ron had said he didn't know. Ginny got excited about things, she was like that. After Mrs. Norris, Harry went to the library. He didn't go to the regular section. He went through the restricted section door, same pressure, 3 inches above the lock, and spent 2 hours with dark artifacts, a formal taxonomy and the properties of living enchantments and the 3rd volume of magical parasitism, historical cases. He came out with 3 things he hadn't had when he went in. The first was a clear theoretical picture of what a magical diary designed to receive and store memory could be used for by someone with sufficient dark magic expertise. The second was a working hypothesis about what the something was that he'd been feeling in the ambient magic of the castle since mid-October, a frequency, low and wrong, like a note that was almost the right pitch but wasn't. The third was the dawning understanding that whatever was in that diary had the quality, in magical terms, of something that used to be alive and still partially was, which was a category of thing that had a specific name. Horcrux. He'd read about them once, in a book from behind the skirting board that had arrived in his 3rd shipment. The Grey Journal had mentioned them obliquely, in the context of ancient magic responses to dark binding. He'd been 9 years old and the concept had been abstract, theoretical, filed away under things that exist but probably aren't relevant. He revised that categorization now. He went looking for Ginny. He found her in the 1st-floor bathroom that students didn't use, the one with the out-of-order sink, sitting on the floor with the diary in her lap and her eyes slightly unfocused in the particular way of someone mid-conversation with something internal. She startled when he opened the door, and the unfocused quality vanished immediately, replaced by embarrassment and a defensive clutch of the diary to her chest. "Harry," she said. I wasn't, the sign says out of order." "I thought, I know it says out of order," Harry said. He came in and sat on the edge of the stone sink opposite her. "Can I see the diary?" She pressed it tighter. "It's mine." "I know it is," he said. Not gently, exactly, but carefully. "Ginny. When you write in it, does it write back?" The color drained from her face so fast he could track it. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "Because I've read about things like it," he said. "And because you've been different since September." "Not Ginny different," something is pulling you different. There's a distinction. She was staring at him. In the muted light of the unused bathroom she looked very small and very young, which she was, 11 years old, youngest of 7, first girl born to the Weasley family in generations, and someone had put something in her cauldron and she'd picked it up without knowing what she was picking up. "It's just a diary," she said, but her hands were shaking. "It's not," Harry said. "I'm sorry, but it isn't." "Can you tell me his name?" "The one who writes back?" A long pause. "Tom," she said finally. "Tom Riddle." Harry was very still for a moment. Then he held out his hand, and he didn't say give it to me because that was the wrong approach. He said, "You don't have to. But if you give it to me I can find out what it actually is. And if I'm wrong about it being harmful, you get it back." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long time. Then she put the diary in it. The moment his fingers closed around the leather cover, everything the books had prepared him for arrived at once and faster than he'd anticipated. The wrong frequency note in the castle's ambient magic resolved, not outward but inward, directed at him specifically, as though the thing inside the diary had been waiting for a target with sufficient magical presence to be worth addressing. He felt it move toward him the way you feel something large moving in dark water, purposeful and cold and very much aware of what it was doing. His own magic responded before he had time to think about it. Not like the stopped glass. Not like the warm wall. This was the deeper thing, the thing the books called ancient magic in its active form, and it didn't ask permission from him before it moved. It went through the diary like light through water, not attacking, not in the conventional sense, because it didn't need to. It simply looked, the way light looks, and what it found was exactly what he'd hypothesized. A fragment. A piece of something that had been deliberately excised and stored and was not alive in any natural sense but was not dead either, and it had been in here for decades, collecting Ginny's memories and her trust and her increasing vulnerability, building itself a door. Harry held the diary in both hands and felt the cold thing inside push against his magic the way you push against a wall that turns out to be load-bearing, and the ancient magic didn't yield and didn't strain. It simply held. The fragment pushed harder. Harry felt it try something more specific, the particular invasive reach of legitimacy, a probing at his mind's edges. He rejected it so cleanly the diary's pages went briefly bright. Ginny made a noise. "It's all right," Harry said, which was nearly true. "Don't touch it." The fragment pushed once more, and then did something he hadn't expected, it retreated. Pulled back. The cold quality thinned. He had the distinct impression of something recalculating, something that had expected a different kind of mind and found instead a fortified one with 2 seals and years of intentional practice and a deep magic it hadn't encountered in this form before. He set the diary on the stone floor and looked at it. "What happened?" Ginny said. Her voice was very small. "It tried to get into my head," Harry said. "It couldn't." She was shaking now, properly. "I wrote things in there. Months of, I told it everything. About Ron and my family and," she stopped. "What is it?" He thought about how to answer that. Then, something someone put a piece of themselves into. Decades ago. They meant it to be used, eventually, to bring them back. He looked at her. "You weren't safe with it. You're safe now. What are you going to do with it?" He looked at the diary. The wrong frequency note in the castle's ambient magic was still there, fainter now, the fragment having retreated into dormancy. He needed to destroy it. The theoretical frameworks he'd read were clear: you couldn't contain a Horcrux, couldn't store it safely, the thing would find another vector. But destruction required a force capable of unmistakably obliterating magical containers of this type, and the list of such forces was short. Basilisk venom. Fiend fire. The force of very specific destructive curses. He did not have any of those currently available. What he had was something the books described only theoretically, in the same section that had described his own situation as catastrophically rare. Ancient magic, in its active form, was listed as a theoretical destroyer of dark containers because of its fundamental incompatibility with intentionally fragmented souls. The logic was straightforward once you understood the architecture. Ancient magic was the deep current of living connection, of love and sacrifice and genuine bond. A Horcrux was the precise inversion, the severing of connection, the murder of another to split what was meant to be whole. They were antithetical at a fundamental level. The book said theoretically. Harry put his hands back on the diary. He didn't perform anything. Didn't speak, didn't point his wand. He simply reached for the thing inside him that had been warm since he was 5 years old, the specific, steady, loaded warmth of 2 seals and the deep magic they'd invoked, and let it move. The diary burned from the inside. Not with fire. The cover didn't char, the pages didn't blacken. It was more like watching ice melt from within, a structural dissolution, the magical coherence of the thing inside it unwinding like yarn pulled from a knot, fast once it started, irreversible. The wrong frequency note in the castle's ambient magic cut off like a switch, so abrupt that Ginny put her hands over her ears by reflex even though there had been no sound. Harry set the diary down. It looked identical to before. He opened it to a random page and it was blank, and all the other pages were blank, and the cold thing was entirely gone. He let out a breath. "It's done," he said. Ginny stared at the diary. Then at Harry. Then at the diary again. "What are you?" she said. Not unkindly. With the wondering, slightly stunned tone of someone who has just watched something that doesn't fit their framework. "I'm working on the full answer," Harry said honestly. "But currently, complicated." She laughed, which surprised them both. It was a real laugh, loose and relieved, and some of the pallor left her face with it. "Are you going to tell anyone about all of this?" Harry thought about it. Dumbledore should know a Horcrux had been in the school, technically. He would also have approximately 40 questions about how Harry had destroyed it, and Harry did not feel like answering 40 questions about his magical abilities to a man he was still in the process of evaluating. "I'll tell McGonagall that someone put a hex diary in your cauldron," he said. "That much is true and that much she needs to know. The rest, not yet." Ginny nodded slowly. Then she looked at her hands. "I can feel the difference," she said. "It was like, there was a voice in my head that sounded like mine but wasn't. And now it's just, mine again." "Good," Harry said. He picked up the diary with a transfiguration into ash that took 3 seconds and left nothing, and they left the bathroom separately, and in the castle's ambient magic the wrong note was simply gone as though it had never been. Lucius Malfoy heard about the diary in December, from a contact in the ministry who had heard something from someone who had heard it from a Hogwarts employee. The chain was long enough to have lost most of its specificity by the time it reached him. What remained was, the diary had been neutralized, a student had been involved, and Mrs. Norris, who had been the first petrification, had been depetrified by Dumbledore without the castle's hidden basilisk being identified or located. He sat in his study and thought about this for a long time. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was for people whose plans lacked redundancy, and Lucius had been building his plans with redundancy for 30 years. The diary had been one layer of a much larger architecture. Its loss was a setback, not a catastrophe. He had other pieces in play. But the question of how it had been neutralized was eating at him. Dumbledore was the obvious candidate, but the information chain suggested Dumbledore had learned about the diary after it was dealt with, not before. A student, then. The castle's protections against Horcrux detection were not something a student should have been able to navigate, theoretically. The dark arts curriculum at Hogwarts did not cover Horcruxes. The restricted section had copies of the relevant texts, but Madame Pants monitored access with the specific paranoia of someone who took her job personally. He thought about Harry Potter in Madame Malkin's, which was the only time he'd seen the boy directly. He thought about the survey quality of his gaze, the complete absence of appropriate deference, the stillness that had no business being in an 11-year-old's body. He thought about what Draco had come home saying in July, with an expression Lucius recognized as the one Draco wore when he'd encountered something he didn't have a framework for. He knew things, father. I don't know how he knew them. He knew about ancient magic. He knew about bonds. And then Draco had stopped, because he was Draco and he was careful with information around Lucius, which was something Lucius had taught him and occasionally resented the results of. He thought about Narcissa. He thought about the months before Draco's first year when she'd been different, quieter, more internal, the locked box that had appeared in her dressing room that he'd located and not opened, because Narcissa's private things were one of the few territories Lucius recognized as not worth the cost of entering. He'd thought it was correspondence she didn't want him to read, which was entirely within the range of things that existed in their marriage without being discussed. He'd left it alone. He thought about it now with different data and felt something shift in his chest. He was not a jealous man in the conventional sense. Their marriage was not a love match and neither of them had ever pretended otherwise. But he was a man who kept very careful inventories of what he owned and what owned him, and Narcissa was in the first category, and anything in her life that he hadn't sanctioned was, on principle, a variable he needed to account for. He opened a drawer. Found a piece of blank parchment. Wrote a single name, T.M. Riddle. He was going to need to be more careful with Harry Potter than he'd originally planned. The boy was not what the stories suggested. He was not a symbol or a legacy, he was something active and structured and considerably more capable than a second year had any business being. Lucius Malfoy did not underestimate things twice. He folded the parchment and burned it, because some thoughts were better not documented, and went to find Narcissa for dinner. She was in the library when he found her, which was not unusual. She was at the desk nearest the eastern window with a quill in her non-dominant hand, which stopped him in the doorway. "Correspondence," he said. She looked up with the particular quality of someone surfacing from a depth. "A note," she said, and her voice was level and mild and told him nothing, which told him something. Nothing requiring attention. He crossed the room and kissed the top of her head in the ritual way of long marriage, and looked at the desk without appearing to look. The note was folded. He caught the address in the moment before she moved her hand to cover it, not all of it, but enough. Privet Drive. He kissed her head again and went to pour himself a drink. "Draco wrote," he said, keeping his back to her. "He seems to have formed some kind of association with Potter." A pause. "I know," she said. "He mentioned it. You're not concerned." "No," she said, and she didn't elaborate, and Lucius turned from the drinks cabinet with his glass and looked at her. Narcissa looked back at him. She was, as always, perfectly composed. Her expression was perfectly arranged. And underneath it, he knew her too well not to see it, something was very certain. Not defiant, not hidden, just certain. The certainty of a woman who has already made her calculations and is not uncertain about the results. "I had a conversation today," Lucius said, sitting down, "about the limits of what second-year students should be capable of." "Did you?" she said. "The diary was destroyed," he said. He watched her face for a reaction and got what she always gave him, a precise, curated surface. Whoever destroyed it understood what it was. That limits the field considerably. "Yes," she agreed. "I imagine it does." "Narcissa." He set his glass down. Not threatening, they did not have the kind of marriage where threats operated openly. Negotiations, yes. Information, carefully rationed. "Is there something I need to know?" She looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight she was exactly what she'd always been, beautiful, composed, contained. And behind it, in a place he'd spent 20 years being adjacent to without gaining entry, something entirely her own. "No," she said, which was technically true, because what she knew Lucius did not need to know and would not, if she could help it, be allowed to access. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his glass and moved the conversation to the French property dispute, and Narcissa answered his questions, and they ate dinner, and went to bed. He lay awake long after she slept, looking at the ceiling, thinking about Privet Drive. January brought more petrifications. 2 Hufflepuff students, then a ghost, then a Ravenclaw whose parents arrived at Hogwarts in a state that Dumbledore handled with his particular combination of warmth and maneuver that Harry had spent 4 months learning to read. The castle was frightened in the specific way that buildings absorbed the emotional states of their populations, the ambient magic dimmer and more cautious. Students moved in groups. The older ones remembered the last time the school had been this way, which was a decade ago, and carried different fears. Harry moved alone, which was not defiance but preference. Groups were slow and often headed the wrong direction. He'd found the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets in November, working from a clue in Hogwarts, a history that the editors of the library edition had apparently considered insufficiently relevant to include. The out-of-order bathroom, the sink with the snake engraving, the Parseltongue command that he'd found documented in a 1600s text describing Salazar Slytherin's particular talents. He hadn't opened it. He'd stood over the sink and said the word and felt the chamber beneath respond like a held breath, and then he'd stepped back and gone to dinner and spent 2 weeks thinking about his options. The basilisk was the problem. Everything else was manageable. The chamber's location was manageable. The heritage it represented, Slytherin's bloodline, Parseltongue, the whole apparatus of blood purity mythology that had been wrapped around it like ivy around a stone, was manageable, if only because Harry had read enough to know that bloodline mythology was functionally identical to the Muggle nationalism he'd read about in history books, the same fear in different clothes. The basilisk was not manageable in the same way. It was 1,000 years old and 60 feet long, and its gaze killed outright. The petrifications so far were accidental, reflections, water, something seen through an intervening surface. He needed to get into the chamber without being seen by the basilisk directly, which the books described as requiring either blindness or a specific magical protection against petrification. Hermione had been working on the basilisk problem from a different angle. She'd been in the library in December with a mirror and fantastic beasts and where to find them and a particular expression she wore when she was 2 steps ahead but hadn't landed yet, and she'd told him what she'd figured out about the reflections, and he'd told her what he knew about the chamber, and there had been a moment of combined intelligence in which the full picture assembled itself between them with the satisfaction of precisely fitted pieces. "You need to go down there," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He paused. "The Parseltongue is the issue. Anyone else down there is a liability because they can't communicate with the snake." "I know." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for situations where she disagreed with the practical conclusion but could not fault the logic. "I hate this." "I know. If I give you a list of precautions, I'll read them," he said, "and I'll take the ones that apply." She gave him a list of 6 precautions. He took 4 of them. He went down on a Wednesday night in January, through the out-of-order bathroom, through the pipe, through tunnels that smelled of river water and old stone, to a chamber that was everything the mythology had promised and also, in the way of things seen clearly rather than imagined, simply a large underground room with poor drainage and an unfortunate decorative theme. The basilisk heard him before it saw him. He had his eyes closed. He'd had them closed since the chamber entrance, navigating by the stone wall and the ambient magic, which in the chamber was thick and old and Slytherin flavored, not evil, precisely, just old and shaped by someone whose priorities had calcified into something ugly. He could feel the snake the way he'd felt the fragment in the diary, a presence, enormous and cold and very, very old. He spoke to it in Parseltongue. Not commands. He started with something simpler. He said, "I know you've been here for 1,000 years. I know you've been following instructions from someone who's been dead for centuries." The basilisk went very still in the chamber. He could feel the stillness like a change in air pressure. "The one who set you here is gone," Harry said. "The piece of him that was using you is gone. I destroyed it. A long silence in the snake's own language, which in Parseltongue was not a silence but a held breath. "What do you want?" the basilisk finally said. "To stop the petrifications," Harry said. "And to make sure no one else gets hurt." "I was told to protect the chamber," the basilisk said. "I was told to kill those unworthy." "The one who told you that is gone," Harry said again. "You've been given an instruction by someone who no longer exists. You don't have to follow it." Another long stillness. Harry kept his eyes closed and felt the enormous magical presence of the creature processing something that, he suspected, it had never been asked to process before. The question of what it owed a dead instruction. "If I stop," the basilisk said slowly, "what becomes of me?" This was, Harry realized, the question everything came down to. Not the drama, not the mythology. Just a very old creature asking what happened to it when the purpose it had been given no longer applied. "I don't know," Harry said honestly. "But I'll find out. And I'll come back." He felt the basilisk look at him, not the killing gaze, the other kind, the assessment. He felt it looking at the magic in him, the two seals and the deep current, and he stood still and let himself be read. "You smell like old promises," the basilisk said finally, which was not a category Harry had anticipated. "The other kind of magic. Not what the dark ones carry." "No," Harry agreed. "Come back," the basilisk said, and settled. Harry found the exit by the same method he'd used to enter, keeping his eyes shut until he was back in the pipes, and he climbed out of the out-of-order bathroom at midnight with mud on his robes and his hands shaking slightly, which he allowed because it was midnight and no one could see. The petrification stopped in February. Dumbledore noticed. Harry watched him noticing, from across Great Hall breakfasts and in the corridor when Dumbledore happened to be walking in the same direction, and he watched the headmaster's calculations run and rerun and come up with an answer that Dumbledore kept turning over in his hands like something that didn't quite fit. McGonagall knew about the hex diary in Ginny's cauldron. She'd handled it with characteristic precision. Lucius Malfoy had been called in for a very pointed conversation that Draco mentioned with the specific tone he used when his father had been made uncomfortable, and which told Harry that Lucius now knew exactly who had neutralized the diary even if he didn't know how. Lucius knowing was a variable Harry added to his model and kept visible. He wrote in his notebook in March, the fourth one now, the pages dense with theory and observation and the developing map of what was coming. "Lucius is smart enough to know the diary's destruction was me. He's smart enough to know this is a problem for whatever he's planning. He'll revise his approach. Watch for the revision." He paused, tapping his quill on the page. Then he wrote, "He knows about Privet Drive." He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote one more line, steady and clear. "Narcissa, if you're paying attention, and you are, it's time." He closed the notebook. Outside the dormitory window, March rain moved across the castle grounds in grey sheets, and the castle's ambient magic was quiet and clean, and Harry Potter sat in it and thought about a woman he hadn't seen since he was 5 years old and understood, with the certainty of someone who has read the relevant texts and done the relevant calculations, that the next time they met it would not be an accident. He was going to make sure of that. Chapter 5. The blood that speaks. The Ministry of Magic in summer looked exactly like power attempting to disguise itself as bureaucracy. Harry had been inside it exactly once before, at 8 years old, when Petunia had dragged him to a Muggle government office in the same building's non-magical layer and he'd stood in a marble lobby and felt something enormous vibrating in the walls above him without knowing what it was. He knew now. He was 13, and he was standing in the atrium of the Wizarding Ministry with Dumbledore 3 feet to his left and 200 witches and wizards moving around him in the specific purposeful chaos of an institution that believed its own importance, and the walls were still vibrating. Dumbledore had brought him. This was not Harry's idea. The occasion was a ministry reception for the International Confederation of Wizards, one of those events that existed primarily to allow important people to be seen being important, and Dumbledore had explained over breakfast that morning with his characteristic combination of warmth and indirection that it would be beneficial for Harry to attend, that certain introductions might be valuable, that it was an opportunity he hoped Harry would embrace. Harry had looked at him across the breakfast table and said, "Who do you want me to meet?" A beat. The twinkle, recalibrating. Several people. I'll introduce them as we go. And what do you want them to think about me? Dumbledore had been quiet for a moment that Harry found genuinely interesting, not the silence of someone caught out, but the silence of someone revising their estimation upward. I want them to see that you're well, he said, and this was partially true, which meant it was partially something else, and Harry filed the something else and said he'd attend. He was in his third year now, which meant he'd had 2 years of watching Dumbledore operate at close range and had a reasonably complete model of how the man thought. Dumbledore was not cruel. He was not petty. He was, however, a man who had been managing crises for 60 years and had developed the specific habit of people as instruments that long crisis management tended to produce. He cared about Harry in the genuine way of someone who also needed Harry to occupy a particular role, and the two things were not incompatible in Dumbledore's framework, which was the part Harry found most worth watching. He followed Dumbledore through the reception with half his attention and used the other half on the room. The attendees sorted themselves into predictable clusters, ministry officials in the center, diplomatic guests on the periphery, the people who actually ran things orbiting between both in the specific pattern of people who understand that the nominal centers of power and the functional ones are different locations. He catalogued faces. Cross-referenced with names he'd learned from the books, from Hermione's reading, from Draco's occasional and carefully rationed pieces of information about wizarding political families. He was halfway through a conversation with a Bulgarian diplomatic delegate whom Dumbledore had very much wanted him to impress, and whom he was apparently impressing without particular effort, which he could tell from Dumbledore's expression in his peripheral vision, when he felt it. The bond. He'd felt it before in a theoretical sense, the warmth in the cupboard, the ambient sense of being watched over, the books arriving. He'd felt it operationally in the chamber, when the ancient magic moved without his direction. He'd felt it as a kind of internal compass, always aware of which direction north was even when he wasn't looking. He had never felt it like this. It hit him mid-sentence, and he finished the sentence on automatic pilot because the rest of him had gone very still and very alert, the way you go still when something moves at the edge of your vision. A resonance, sudden and specific and close, the frequency he'd been feeling for 8 years but at a volume and immediacy that he hadn't experienced before, because he'd only ever felt it at distance. She was in this room. He excused himself from the Bulgarian delegate with a composure he was quietly proud of, said something to Dumbledore about finding a drink, and turned to look at the room properly. It took him 11 seconds. She was near the eastern wall, beside a tall wizard in charcoal robes who Harry placed immediately as a senior magical law official he'd read about. She was in silver gray, the color almost identical to her eyes, and her hair was the exact shade of pale blonde that he'd only seen in one other person, which was her son. She held a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from, and she was listening to the conversation around her with the specific quality of someone who is the most intelligent person present and has arranged their expression so that this is not visible. Narcissa Malfoy. He stood still for a moment and simply looked at her. She hadn't seen him yet. She was 40 feet away, in profile, with the room between them, and she looked exactly like the woman he'd been building a composite of for 8 years from the handwriting and the book selections and the theoretical frameworks, and one gray afternoon when he was 5 years old, and also nothing like that composite, because she was real and in the room and the bond was singing between them at a frequency that he felt in his sternum. He started walking. Narcissa knew something had changed approximately 4 seconds before she saw him. It was the bond, which she understood better now than she had at 31, had spent 9 years understanding better, in her locked box, in her research, in the books she'd had to stop sending in July when Lucius had begun monitoring the proxy account with a thoroughness that told her he was looking for something specific. She'd stopped the books to protect the channel and had hated herself for it for 2 months before identifying an alternative route that he hadn't found yet. She felt the bond shift the way she always felt it when she'd been in his proximity in the years at Hogwarts. He was 13 now, which meant she'd been feeling his Hogwarts years as a background warmth with the school's magical infrastructure amplifying the connection. But this was different. This was direct proximity, and the bond responded to that the way it responded to nothing else, a sudden full-throated resonance that made her hand tighten on the champagne flute and her breath come slightly wrong. She had been dreading this. Not because she didn't want to see him, she'd been managing the wanting to see him for 9 years and had become functionally expert at it. She had been dreading this because she didn't know who she would find. She'd sent him books and he'd read them and she'd felt him reading them and she had built a picture of someone extraordinary, and the gap between a picture and a person was a gap she hadn't crossed yet and was going to have to cross now. He walked out of the crowd toward her, and she had 3 seconds to compose herself while she was still in profile to him, and she used them. Then she turned. He was tall for 13, taller than she expected, though she should have expected it. Lily Potter's family were tall people. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, the same green she'd noticed first before the scar, and he was moving through the reception with the unhurried directness of someone who always knows exactly where they're going. His expression was, she searched for the word and didn't find a single one. Certain. Focused. Not aggressive, not performing anything. He simply looked like someone walking toward a thing he'd been walking toward for a long time. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. Up close, his eyes were very green and very clear, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen directed at herself before. Not awe, not the social calculation she received from most people at ministry functions, not anything she had a ready category for. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've had a map of for years and are now seeing in person, checking the map against the territory. She said, "Harry Potter." Her voice came out level, which was impressive given what was happening in her chest. "Narcissa Black," he said. "Not Malfoy. Black." She felt the deliberateness of it land precisely where he'd intended it to land. "You know who I am," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him for a long moment. Around them the reception continued its business, conversations, champagne, the ambient noise of important people being important. Nobody was paying attention to a woman speaking with a Hogwarts student. She was aware of Lucius on the other side of the room, engaged with the minister and almost certainly aware of her location in the way he was always aware of her location. "How long," she said, "is a while?" "Since I was 10, he said. "I read the annotated laws of magical inheritance. Page 207. She was quiet for a moment. She recognized the book. She had sent it. "You knew and you didn't," she stopped. "I waited," he said simply. "I thought it was better to meet you when I could meet you properly." She looked at him and felt 8 years of carefully managed distance collapse into the fact of him standing 2 feet away, and the bond between them was so loud in her chest she was genuinely surprised no one else could hear it. "And now?" "Now we're in the same room," he said. "For the first time since I was 5. A long beat. You remember?" "I remember everything," he said. "The caramel was blood orange. You said my aunt sounded exhausting." Something in her face moved, despite herself. "She does," she said. "She really does," he agreed, and something in his tone, the warmth of it, the familiarity, as though they were continuing a conversation that had been running for 8 years without needing a room, made her have to look away for a moment, over his shoulder, at nothing. "Mr. Potter," she said carefully. "You understand that this is complicated." "Yes," he said. "My husband, I know about your husband," he said, and his voice didn't change. Not dismissive, not challenging. Just clear. "I know what he did in 2nd year. I know he's been running calculations about me since Diagon Alley. I know he knows about Privet Drive, which is why the book stopped." He paused. "I'm not afraid of Lucius Malfoy." She looked at him sharply. "That's not bravado," he said. "I've read his whole file, basically. He's intelligent and he's dangerous and he's going to be a problem. But I'm not afraid of him, and I'm not going to pretend I am to manage this conversation. She stared at him. You sent me 12 books, he said. You started when I was 6. You chose every single one of them specifically and built them on each other like a curriculum, and you did it without putting your name on any of them. That's not the behavior of someone who wants to be at a safe distance. That's the behavior of someone who made a decision and has been honoring it for years. Narcissa was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. Then, very quietly, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered being careful with the answer and decided against it. "A child," she said. "Even knowing what you are, I think I expected a child." "I know," he said. "The books did that. I grew up faster than you accounted for." "Yes." She looked at him and felt the particular ache of something you've been managing finally being allowed to simply be. "I should have," she stopped. "There are things I should have done differently." "The books were right," he said. "Everything else, there wasn't a version of it that worked without Lucius." "I know that." He paused. "I'm not angry." "You should be," she said, more sharply than she intended. "Maybe," he said. "But I'm not." He looked at her steadily. "You kept me warm," he said, and it was such a simple, direct statement that she felt it like something physical. "In the cupboard. When I was 5 and 6 and 7, the warmth was there every night. You didn't know you were doing it and you couldn't have known what it meant to me. But it's the reason I'm standing here talking to you instead of being whatever the Dursleys were making me." She pressed her lips together. When she spoke her voice was level by an act of will. "The cupboard. Under the stairs," he said. "For 11 years. She looked at him for a long moment and felt the grief of it and the fury of it in equal measure, the particular fury of a woman who would have done something if she'd known and was now cataloguing what she could do with the knowing. "Harry, it's done," he said. "I'm out of it. I have what I need." He paused. "I need one more thing, actually." "What?" "I need you to tell me everything you know about the bond," he said. "What you've researched. What the Grey Journal says. What you think is coming." He held her gaze. "Because I have a picture and I think it's mostly right, but you have pieces I don't." She looked at him, this 13-year-old who had just dismantled years of careful management with the precise and unhurried competence of someone who had prepared for this conversation longer than she had, and felt something settle in her own chest that had been unsettled since she was 31 years old. "Not here," she said. "No," he agreed. "This will have consequences," she said. Not warning him, informing him, which was different. "I know. Lucius will, I know," he said again. "I've thought about Lucius." He paused. "Have you?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Yes. More recently than you might think." Something in his expression shifted, still the same certainty, but with a warmer quality underneath it. "Good," he said. Then, "Draco is more complicated," she said. "Yes," Harry agreed. "But I think he already knows something. He doesn't have all of it, but he's close." He looked at her steadily. "I've been careful with him. I haven't told him anything he wasn't ready to hear." She felt something in her chest that she identified, after a moment, as gratitude, specific and profound, the gratitude of a mother whose child has been handled with more care than the circumstances required. "Thank you," she said. "He's important," Harry said simply. "He's yours." She looked away again, over the room, at the evening proceeding around them in its ceremonial patterns. Lucius was still engaged with the minister, but she could feel his awareness the way she always felt it, the directional sense of his attention. She had perhaps 4 more minutes before he looked toward her. "There's an owl that uses the school's post," she said, very quietly. "Brown, 1 white tail feather. His name is Corvus. He'll know you if you use him, regardless of who sends him. She paused. He doesn't go through the proxy account. Harry absorbed this. When? After tonight's events, she said, with a quality that told him this wasn't the only thing happening in his third year. Sirius Black, he said, which was not a question. She went very still. You know, she said. He's innocent, Harry said. Pettigrew framed him. I've known since last year, the timeline is wrong and the magic doesn't add up and I've been, he stopped. Looked at her. Is he alive? Yes, she said, because Narcissa Black had not stopped tracking her family even when her family was sorted into categories the world called dangerous, because she was a Black before anything else and that meant something to her that the world's categorization of her family did not cancel. He escaped Azkaban 3 months ago. I know. I need to find him before, Remus Lupin, she said. 3rd floor corridor, 2nd door on the left. He's your defense teacher this year and he was your father's friend and he knows where Sirius is. Harry looked at her. Then, you've been thinking about this. Since March, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular quality she was learning was his version of warmth, direct, unperformed, entirely intentional, you've been looking after me for 9 years. Yes, she said. Simply. I'm going to look after you back, he said. Starting now. You should know that. She looked at him and felt 8 years of the bond resonating between them, and for the first time since she'd walked out of the Undercroft market she let herself feel the full weight of what they were to each other without managing it or containing it. It was large. It was old. It was entirely unlike anything she'd planned for her life. Harry, she said. Yes? Be careful with Sirius tonight, she said. And with Lupin. And there's a complication about the moon. He blinked. Lupin is, yes. Tonight specifically? Look at the sky, she said, and Lucius was turning now, she could feel it, and she made a small adjustment to her position and her expression that would read from across the room as nothing more than a brief pleasantry with a student. I need to go, she said. Not apologetically. Factually. I know. He paused. I'll write to Corvus. I'll write back, she said. And then, because it was the truest thing and she had spent 9 years not saying true things out loud, I'm glad you're well. He looked at her and something in his face did the thing that still caught her, the not quite a child quality, the specific ancient sureness. I'm glad you're you, he said, which was so simple and so exact that she had nothing to say in response, and he stepped back and let her walk away. She walked across the reception with her champagne flute and her silver-gray robes and her perfectly composed expression and joined Lucius by the minister's group, and she felt Harry Potter's gaze on her back like sunlight, direct and warm, and she did not look back. She was smiling, though. Very slightly. She didn't bother to arrange that away. Lupin confirmed everything in his office on the 3rd floor while rain moved against the windows and the castle hummed around them, and Harry sat across from a man who had the worn, kind face of someone who has been carrying a particular weight for a very long time and has made a separate peace with it. You know, Lupin said. Not surprised. Resigned in the gentle way of someone who finds the child in front of them persistently ahead of his own narrative. Most of it, Harry said. Pettigrew framed Sirius. Where is he? Lupin was quiet for a moment. He had a specific quality, Harry noted, that very few adults had. He was genuinely present, not managing the conversation, not positioning himself relative to it. He was simply in it. How did you? The timeline in the press accounts doesn't work, Harry said. The Fidelius charm wasn't done how they said it was, or the street wouldn't have been the way it was afterward. And the finger. Wormtail's finger. If 12 people died and only a finger remained, either the killing curse does something physically inconsistent with every documented account, or he faked the death. He paused. Who was the secret keeper? Lupin closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them they were very direct. Sirius was supposed to be. He convinced your parents to switch to Peter at the last minute. A decoy, he said. He was the obvious choice and that made him dangerous to use. A pause. Peter was a Death Eater. Had been for years. None of us knew. Harry absorbed this. Where is Sirius now? The North Tower, Lupin said, after a moment. He came here because Peter is here. He can feel animagi, it's one of his abilities, from the transformation. He knows Peter is in the castle. Harry was very still. Scabbers, he said. Lupin nodded. Harry sat back and thought about Ron, who had carried his rat through 4 years of Hogwarts and slept in the same dormitory as Peter Pettigrew, and felt a cold, specific fury that he held onto and didn't act on immediately, because acting on it immediately was not the right approach. I need to see Sirius, he said. Harry, he's my godfather, Harry said. He's innocent. And I have resources that you don't currently know about, that might be useful to how this resolves. He met Lupin's gaze. I'm not asking you to expose yourself. I'm asking you to take me to the North Tower. Lupin looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating expression that Harry had come to recognize as the face of an adult genuinely uncertain whether to treat him as his age or as what he was. You're 13, Lupin said. I destroyed a Horcrux in 2nd year, Harry said. Alone. Without a wand. A silence that was quite long. Albus didn't know how it was destroyed, Lupin said slowly. No, Harry said. But you did it. Yes. Lupin looked at him for another moment. Then he stood up. The North Tower, he said. Come on. Sirius Black was thinner than the photographs, which were 12 years old and had been taken in a cell, so this wasn't saying much. He had the specific gauntness of Azkaban survivors, not starvation exactly, but something eaten from the inside by years of dementors, the hollowing out of a person by sustained proximity to despair. His eyes, though. His eyes were the same in every photograph and in person, gray and alive and, right now, looking at Harry with an intensity that had 12 years of waiting compressed into it. You look like James, Sirius said. Except the eyes. The eyes are completely Lily. I know, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. You're not frightened of me. No. Most people are. Most people think you killed 13 people, Harry said. I don't. Sirius made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something rawer. Remus told you. Some. I'd worked out most of it. Harry sat down on the floor of the tower room, because there was nowhere else to sit, and looked at his godfather. Where's Pettigrew now? Your friend's rat, Sirius said. Ron Weasley. I tracked him here in September. He's been hiding for 12 years in that form, he panics easily, he'll run if he thinks I'm close. He doesn't know I know, Harry said. We have some time. He paused. I need to understand what you need. What the end of this looks like for you. Sirius stared at him. You're 13. I've been 13 for 2 months, Harry said. It's not my most important characteristic. Something in Sirius's expression cracked open, not the Azkaban gauntness, something behind it, something that was the man before 12 years of wrongful imprisonment. He laughed, and this one was real. Merlin, you sound like Lily. She used to do that, state the obvious thing so precisely you couldn't argue with it. I've been told that before, Harry said. What do you need? A trial, Sirius said. I never had one. That's all, a ministry hearing, veritaserum, witnesses. Peter exposed. That's everything. Harry thought about this. He thought about Fudge, who he'd read enough about to have a solid model of, a political creature, primarily concerned with optics, not corrupt exactly but not brave either. He thought about what it would take to force a hearing when the official position was that the case was closed. He thought about who he knew who had sufficient ministry leverage. He thought about Narcissa. "I need a week," he said. "Don't approach Pettigrew yet. I need to put something in place first." Sirius looked at him with the expression everyone eventually wore when they'd fully processed that the 13-year-old in front of them was operating at a different frequency than expected. "What are you putting in place?" "A guarantee," Harry said. "A legal one. Something Fudge can't quietly make disappear." He had Lupin's quill and a piece of paper, and he wrote to Corvus that night, in the dormitory at midnight while Ron slept above him, Ron's rat tucked in its cage, and he told Narcissa what he needed and why he needed it, and he sent the letter without hesitation. The reply came in 40 hours. Brown owl, one white tail feather. Narcissa's handwriting, dominant hand this time, which meant this was not secret correspondence but a formal document, something she'd written understanding it would be seen. Attached to the letter was a copy of a formal complaint filed to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, signed by Narcissa Black Malfoy, citing a technicality in the improper use of magic regulations that required a formal review of all Azkaban sentences handed down without trial during the period 1980 to 1982. The complaint was narrow enough to be technically procedural. It was also, Harry could see immediately, a lever, the kind that moved the right machinery if applied correctly. He read the letter itself. "This will force a review period of 30 days in which any flagged case must receive a hearing date. It won't give you a trial automatically. It gives you a window. What you do with the window is yours. Be careful with the moon." And he looked at that last line for a moment. Then he looked at the letter's postscript, written in a slightly different pressure that suggested she'd added it after the main letter was done. "P.S. Draco wrote this week. He says you explained Pythagoras to him in a way that finally made sense. I don't know what that means exactly, but he seemed pleased, which is unusual, so, thank you." Harry sat with this letter in his hands and felt the warmth in his chest at a volume that he was going to need to find a better word for, eventually. He put the letter in his notebook, checked the moon, and went to find Pettigrew. The end of it was not clean, because the end of things rarely was. Pettigrew was cornered in the common room at 2 in the morning by Harry and Sirius together, Lupin waiting at the portrait hole, and Pettigrew's transformations and his panic and his 12 years of desperation made him something that was both pitiable and irredeemable in the same body. Harry felt nothing that could be described as mercy and also felt no need to be cruel, which were not contradictory. He felt the specific clarity of someone watching a thing resolve the way it was supposed to resolve. Pettigrew tried to appeal to Harry directly, which was interesting in its misreading. He talked about James Potter, about old loyalty, about how things had been complicated, and Harry listened with complete attention and no softness whatsoever, and when Pettigrew finished Harry said, "You gave my parents to someone who killed them. Everything else is detail." Pettigrew transformed and ran. He made it 6 feet before Harry's magic stopped him in mid-air, not violent, not punishing, just an absolute physical halt that left the rat dangling in nothing, legs scrambling, going nowhere. "I need him alive and in human form," Harry said to Sirius, who was watching with an expression that was not quite what Harry expected from someone looking at the man who'd destroyed his life. It was something more complicated, grief and fury and, underneath, a very tired relief. "Right," Sirius said, and transformed, and Pettigrew, faced with a large dog and a 13-year-old who had stopped him in mid-air without appearing to try, made the pragmatic decision. The ministry hearing happened 17 days later. Narcissa's filing had done exactly what she'd said it would do, created the window. Dumbledore provided testimony. Harry provided testimony that the ministry representative attempted 3 times to redirect and that he refused to be redirected from, speaking with the clear factual precision of someone who knows exactly what they know and is not interested in how it lands. Lupin provided testimony. Pettigrew, under Veritaserum, confessed to everything. Fudge shook Harry's hand afterward with the uncomfortable expansiveness of a politician who has been outmaneuvered and is making the best of it. Harry shook it, said the minimum required, and went to find Sirius. Sirius had been given a room in the ministry's medical wing while the paperwork processed. He was sitting on a bed looking at his own hands when Harry found him, and he looked up with eyes that were doing several different things at once. "Free," Harry said. "Free," Sirius repeated, as though testing the word's structural integrity. "You'll want time," Harry said. "To process it." "All of it." "That's fine." Sirius looked at him. "Where are you going?" "Back to school." He paused. "For now." "You can, Harry." Sirius stopped. Started again with the particular difficulty of a man attempting something emotionally precise after 12 years of being emptied out. "You could come to me. Over the summer. If you wanted to. You don't have to go back to." He stopped again. "The cupboard is irrelevant now," Harry said. "I have one more summer there and then I don't." "But yes." He paused. "Yes, I want to." Sirius let out a breath that he'd probably been holding since 1981. Harry sat down on the bed next to him, and they sat in the ministry medical wing in the specific companionable quiet of people who have just done something difficult together and have landed on the other side, and Sirius eventually said, "How did you, the filing?" "Narcissa Malfoy's filing." "I asked her to," Harry said simply. Sirius was very quiet. "She's a Black," he said, finally. "Not a judgment. A fact being placed carefully." "Yes," Harry said. "So are you." Sirius looked at him. Then, slowly, something like a smile, real, worn, the first one that had reached his eyes. "You're going to explain all of this to me at some point." "Over the summer," Harry said. "All of it." He took the train back to Hogwarts that evening, arriving after the others had gone to dinner, and he went to the dormitory and opened his notebook and sat on his bed and thought about the year. He thought about Narcissa's face in the ministry atrium, the specific quality of her composure, the effort of it, and the smile she hadn't arranged away. He thought about what she'd said, "I'm glad you're well." He thought about what he'd said back, which was true and would remain true. He thought about what was coming. Sirius free. Pettigrew's confession naming Voldemort by implication. The Triwizard Tournament next year. He'd read about the announcement in Practical Magical Theories section on educational cooperation. The gathering of pieces around a center point that was moving toward him whether he moved toward it or not. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. He wrote, "3rd year. Outcomes. Sirius Black, free. Pettigrew, confessed. Lupin, compromised, Moon, but not exposed. Narcissa, contact established. Direct." He paused. He wrote, "She looked at me the same way she looked at me when I was 5. Like I was the thing she was looking at, not the symbol or the story." He wrote, "No one has ever done that for as long as she has." He closed the notebook. In Malfoy Manor, in a library that smelled of old books and quiet magic, Narcissa sat at her writing desk and felt the bond in her chest settle into something that she had been circling for 9 years and was now ready to name, privately, in the same locked box where she kept everything that mattered most. Not yet. Not with everything that was coming. Not with Lucius and the Dark Lord's inevitable return and Draco at 17 carrying the weight of his father's choices and all the machinery of war beginning to move again in the background of ordinary life. Not yet. But she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling it. The warmth. Specific, steady, directional. The frequency she'd accidentally set in a 5-year-old boy in a market that smelled of rain and burned sugar and that had been singing back to her ever since. She thought, "He's safe." She thought, "He's extraordinary." She thought, for the first time in 9 years, without managing it or containing it or arranging it away, "I know." And left it there, true and whole and quietly enormous, in the private architecture of herself. Chapter 6. What was always owed. The goblet of fire spat Harry's name out on a Thursday evening in October. He watched the slip of parchment float down from the blue-white flame, watched Dumbledore catch it, watched the headmaster unfold it and read it and go very still, and he was already calculating before Dumbledore said his name aloud. The hall went silent in the specific way that 500 people going silent simultaneously goes silent, a collective intake that then held, and Harry stood up from the Gryffindor table with the deliberate calm of someone who has been expecting a move and is not surprised by its direction. He'd put his name in himself. This required explanation, which he'd given only to Hermione, who had looked at him across the library table in September with the expression she wore when she disagreed with his methodology but could not fault his reasoning. He'd put his name in because the alternative was someone else putting it in for him, which was coming regardless. He'd felt it in the structure of the event from the moment the announcement was made, the way you feel the shape of a trap before you see the mechanism. Someone was going to put his name in the goblet because someone needed him in the tournament. He'd decided that if he was going to be in the tournament, he was going to be in it on his own terms, with his own preparation, rather than as a surprised 14-year-old navigating it from behind. Hermione had said, "That's either brilliant or catastrophic." He'd said, "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She'd gone back to her book, which meant she'd accepted it. He walked up to the front of the hall and took the parchment from Dumbledore, and the headmaster was looking at him with the evaluating quality he always carried but sharper now, recalibrated, because Dumbledore was trying to work out whether this was a catastrophic development for his plans or an advantageous one and hadn't landed yet. Harry let him calculate. He met Dumbledore's eyes without particular expression and followed the other three champions into the back room. Cedric Diggory was tall and steady and looked at Harry with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had decided to make the best of a strange situation. He said, "Glad you're in it, actually. Might be useful to have someone sensible." Harry looked at him. Likewise. Fleur Delacour was assessing him with the specific intelligence of someone who had heard the name Harry Potter many times and was in the process of revising her existing model against the actual data. Victor Crumb was studying him the way Crumb apparently studied everything, with the concentrated attention of someone for whom most things were problems to be analyzed rather than experienced. The officials arrived. There was shouting, Fudge doing the thing Fudge did when political complications presented themselves, which was to be loud about procedure and quiet about anything substantive. Dumbledore was very calm in the way he was calm when he was thinking hard. Karkaroff was hostile in the specific way of someone who had expected a different result from the goblet and was performing surprise to avoid performing disappointment. Harry said almost nothing through the whole of it. He answered the direct questions and let the adults perform their confusion and thought about the tournament's 3 tasks and which of the books he'd read were going to be most useful. He was going to win. This was not arrogance. This was arithmetic. The letter from Corvus arrived in November, brown owl, white tail feather, the warmth of it in his palm before he'd even broken the seal. She'd heard about the goblet. "Of course you put your name in yourself," she wrote. "I recognize the logic immediately and I want you to know it's sound and also infuriating in equal measure. The first task is on the 24th. I have a contact in the organizing committee who confirmed it involves creatures. Specifically, dragons. 4 of them, 1 per champion. You know what to do with that information. NPS Draco is furious you're in the tournament. He hasn't said this directly but I know my son. He's furious because he's frightened and he doesn't know how to be frightened about you specifically without it meaning something he's not ready to examine. Be patient with him." Harry read the postscript twice. Then he wrote back, "I'm always patient with Draco. He's worth it." He sent Corvus back with the note and thought about dragons. He thought about the Animagus registry. He thought about the specific mechanics of the summoning charm at altitude, which he'd been practicing wandlessly in the room of requirement since September and could now execute with the precision of someone who had done it several hundred times. He thought about the horntail specifically, which he'd read about in dragon species of Great Britain and Ireland and which had a blind spot of approximately 40 degrees on its left flank when tracking fast lateral movement. He went to the room of requirement and practiced until midnight. The first task was a dragon. The Hungarian horntail, specifically, which was not a coincidence, it was the most aggressive of the 4, and whoever had rigged the draw had known that. Harry stood in the enclosure and looked at the horntail, and the horntail looked at him, and the crowd above them went through its arc of noise, and he thought, 40 degrees, left flank, lateral movement. His broom arrived on the summoning charm so fast it caused a sonic snap that made the crowd react. He flew the horntail for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and the crowd's noise changed pitch twice, once when he dropped into a dive that cleared the dragon's tail by approximately 2 feet, once when he came up at the angle he'd calculated, from the left flank, the blind spot, and took the golden egg off the nest with the same ease he'd have taken it off a desk. He landed. The crowd was doing something that wasn't quite one sound. He looked up at the judges' stands, then at the champions' box where Cedric and Crumb and Fleur were watching, and then at the spectator stands. He was looking for one face specifically, and the stands were full and far away, and he didn't find it. But he felt the warmth in his chest spike bright and specific, the way it did in close proximity, and he thought, she's here. He found Sirius in Hogsmeade that evening, because Sirius had been at every significant event since his acquittal with the particular quality of someone who had spent 12 years being too late to things and was not going to be too late anymore. He was in the back room of the Three Broomsticks looking far healthier than he had in the Ministry medical wing, which was not difficult, but genuinely better, less gaunt, more present. They sat with Butterbeer and Harry told him everything, including the warmth he'd felt in the stands, and Sirius listened with the specific expression he wore when processing information that surprised him. She was there, Sirius said. Yes. Lucius wasn't. He wasn't in the stands, I'd have noticed Lucius. He paused. Narcissa came to watch your first task alone. Harry said nothing, because nothing was the right response to a true observation. Sirius looked at him for a moment. He'd had, over the summer at Grimmauld Place, 4 months of full accounting, the market, the books, the ministry, all of it, and he'd listened without interrupting, which had cost him visible effort, and then he'd said, she's a Black. They love dangerously or they don't love at all. And then he'd looked at Harry and said, you're 14. And Harry had said, I know what I am. And Sirius had looked at him for a long moment and then said, yes. You do. And they'd moved on. The second task, Sirius said now. February, Harry said. I know what it is. Sirius looked at him. The egg screams underwater, Harry said. Which means the second task is underwater. They take something, someone, that the champion cares about. You retrieve them in an hour. How did you? I worked it out in October, Harry said. I've been practicing underwater breathing since November. He paused. I thought about what they might take. Hermione's the obvious choice. Possibly Ron. Sirius was quiet for a moment. You're not worried? I'm going to get them back, Harry said. Being worried is for people who haven't prepared. Sirius shook his head slowly. You know what you remind me of, when you do that? Lily, probably. Lily, Sirius confirmed. Exactly Lily. The second task went as planned. Hermione was at the bottom of the lake, 40 feet down, held in the magical stasis the organizers used, and Harry got to her in 18 minutes using a transfiguration he'd developed in November for the specific purpose, retrieved her, and was back at the surface in 41 minutes with time remaining. He'd also brought up the others, Cho Chang for Cedric, a girl he didn't know for Crumb, Fleur's sister for her, because the logic of leaving people at the bottom of a lake because the task didn't technically require their retrieval was not logic he was able to operate by. Dumbledore, at the judges' table, had the expression he wore when Harry had exceeded the explicit parameters of a situation in a way that was difficult to penalize. He gave him first place. The warmth in his chest during the second task had been consistent and close. She was there again. He scanned the stands methodically and didn't locate her, which meant she was somewhere outside the primary spectator section, and by the time he was out of the water and past the immediate aftermath there was no reasonable way to search. He went back to the castle thinking about the third task. March brought the Yule Ball aftermath, which was to say, it brought Ron having complicated feelings about Hermione in a way that he expressed through the specific male mechanism of being irritable about everything tangentially related to the real subject, and Hermione being hurt in the way of someone who had expected better from a person she'd been patient with for 3 years. Harry navigated between them with the weary competence of someone who could see exactly what was happening and had no power to make either of them say it. He was at the library table on a Thursday in March when Draco sat down across from him. This was their established language, the library, Thursday evenings, the section at the back that Madame Pants visited last. They'd been doing it since first year and it had evolved over 3 years into something Harry found consistently useful and occasionally essential. Draco had access to information that Harry didn't, and Harry had access to perspectives that Draco didn't, and the exchange was honest in the way that things between them had always been honest, which was one of the things Harry valued most about it. Draco sat down and didn't say anything for a moment. Harry looked at him. He had the quality he'd had since October but sharper, the frightened underneath quality his mother had identified in the postscript. He looked like someone who had been carrying something for months and had reached the natural limit of how long a person could carry it alone. "My father has been meeting with people," Draco said. "At the manor. People I recognize from stories. People who were at the Dark Lord's side." Harry kept his expression level. "Since when?" "August," Draco said. "It started in August and it's been more frequent. He doesn't tell me what they discuss. He doesn't tell my mother either, but she knows." He paused. "She always knows." "Yes," Harry said. Draco looked at him. "Something is happening. Something is coming to a point." He stopped. Then, with the precision of someone who has been working up to saying a specific thing and has decided to say it, "I don't want any part of what my father is building." The library was quiet around them. "I know," Harry said. "How long have you known?" "Since first year," Harry said. "You told me in the library in October that you didn't know what you wanted your connection to me to be. You had a dozen opportunities since then to act on your father's preferences about me and you never took any of them. That told me everything." Draco was looking at him with an expression that was part relief and part something more complicated. "He's going to ask me to do something," Draco said. "I don't know what yet. But I know he's moving toward it. When he does," Harry said, "tell me." "You can't protect me from my father," Draco said, and it came out with more rawness than he probably intended. "No," Harry agreed. "But you don't need me to protect you from him. You need me to be on your side when you make the choice not to be him." He held Draco's gaze. "That's different." Draco was quiet for a moment. "Then, you know about my mother?" "Yes." "How much?" "Everything, I think." He paused. "She didn't tell me. I worked it out." Draco looked at him for a long time. His expression had the quality of someone for whom several disconnected things have just become one connected thing, and it was large, and he was deciding whether to be angry about it or something else. He said, very quietly, "She's been protecting you." "Yes. For years. Since I was 5, Harry said. Draco looked away, at the shelves, at nothing. His jaw was doing something controlled. "She should have told me." "She was protecting you too," Harry said. "From the information. From what it would have made you responsible for, knowing it." A silence. Then Draco said, What is it? Between you?" Harry considered the answer carefully, because Draco deserved a real one. "The truest thing I can say," he said, "is that she looked at me when I was 5 like I was a person, and no one else was doing that, and something in both of us recognized something in the other, and the magic between us responded to that. And she's been present ever since. In the ways she could be." Draco's expression moved through several things. "Then, you care about her?" "Yes," Harry said. "No qualification, no management." Draco looked at the table. looked at Harry. "She cares about you," he said, and it cost him something to say it, but he said it without flinching. "I've watched her for 4 years since you arrived at Hogwarts and, yes. She does." "I know," Harry said. "I don't know how I feel about that." "You don't have to know yet," Harry said. "It's complicated. It's allowed to be complicated." Draco was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Harry with something that had cleared, the way a window clears when you wipe the condensation off it. "The third task," he said. "I don't know specifics, but I heard my father say it. The maze. It's not just a maze." "I know," Harry said. "He's going to be at the end of it," Draco said. "The Dark Lord." Harry held his gaze steadily. "I know. You're not frightened." "Of course I am," Harry said. "But being frightened isn't the same as being stopped." Draco looked at him and said nothing for a moment, and in the quiet of the library, with the Hogwarts magic running through the walls around them like a slow river, he nodded. Not agreement, exactly. Something more fundamental. Acknowledgement of who Harry was, without reservation. "Tell my mother," Draco said. "Whatever happens. Tell her." "She already knows," Harry said. "She always already knows." The night of the third task was warm. The maze rose 50 feet at the edges of the Quidditch pitch, the hedges enchanted and dark, the path inside shifting and unpredictable. Harry stood at the entrance with Cedric to his right and the crowd at his back and the warmth in his chest so bright it was almost distracting. He turned once and looked at the stands. He hadn't been able to find her visually at any of the other tasks. He didn't try to find her now. He simply held the feeling, the specific frequency of it, the 2 seals and the deep current, the 8 years of books and the grey afternoon and "I'm glad you're well," and let it settle. Then he walked into the maze. The maze had acromantulas and a boggart and sphinx and sections of bewitched fog that reversed your directional sense, and Harry navigated all of it with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been practicing magical problem-solving since he was 9 years old. The sphinx he answered in 30 seconds. The fog he countered with the compass-equivalent function of the bond, which always knew north and therefore always knew direction. The acromantula he sent away with Parseltongue, which surprised both of them. He found Cedric at the maze's halfway point, disoriented and bleeding from a cut above his ear from something in the eastern section. They went the rest of the way together, which was not tactically optimal and also the only option Harry considered. The Triwizard Cup was in the maze's center, exactly where Draco's information had suggested it would be. Harry stopped 10 feet from it. "It's a portkey," he said. Cedric looked at him. "How do you?" "I can feel it," Harry said. "The cup has been modified. It's going to take whoever touches it somewhere specific." Cedric was quiet for a moment. "To him?" "Yes." Cedric looked at the cup. Then at Harry. "We should take it together," he said. "You should go back," Harry said. "You shouldn't go alone." "I've been preparing for this for 4 years," Harry said. "You haven't." Cedric looked at him. "You're 14. "I'm aware," Harry said. "Go back, Cedric." Cedric didn't. He grabbed the cup at the same moment Harry did, and the portkey took them both. The graveyard was exactly what it was. Cold, dark, the kind of dark that came before something happened rather than after. An old yew tree, a marble headstone, a stone cauldron over a fire. Wormtail, who Harry recognized immediately, and then the thing in Wormtail's arms, which he could feel before he saw it, the specific wrong-frequency note from the diary, but larger, concentrated, the source rather than the fragment. Wormtail tied Harry to the headstone while Cedric, who'd been hit with a stunning spell, was unconscious 12 feet away. The ritual was fast. Bone of the father, flesh of the servant, Wormtail's hand, removed with such performative sacrifice that Harry noted the theater of it, and blood of the enemy, which Harry provided involuntarily, a cut on his arm over the cauldron. He watched all of it and let his magic settle into itself the way you settle your weight before lifting something heavy. Voldemort rose from the cauldron. Harry had read every documented account of Tom Riddle in existence. He'd read Dumbledore's notes, accessed through the kind of information pathway that required both intelligence and complete disregard for theoretical limitations. He'd read the Ministry files from the First War. He'd read the dark magic theory and the Horcrux documentation and the accounts of the survivors. He knew what this person had been and what the accumulation of dark choices did to a person over time, at the magical and physical level. He was still, standing here in the flesh, remarkable in the specific way that genuine darkness is remarkable, stripped of everything ordinary, all the human softness, and therefore somehow both more and less than the sum of its history. Voldemort looked at him with red eyes and said, "Harry Potter. The boy who lived." "Tom Riddle," Harry said. "The man who didn't die properly." A silence that had several dimensions. "You're not frightened," Voldemort said, with the quality of someone revising their expectations. "I've been expecting you," Harry said. "Expecting me?" He tilted his head. The wand was in his hand, 13.5 inches, the pair of Holly's core. "You're very calm for someone about to die." "I'm not going to die," Harry said. "No?" The voice had the quality of a man performing curiosity at something he finds genuinely interesting. "The killing curse was unable to destroy you as an infant. You think the protection holds?" "I know it does," Harry said. "I've read the theory. I understand what my mother did. And I understand what was layered on top of it afterward." Something in Voldemort's expression shifted, the tiniest recalibration, an acknowledgement that the terrain had a feature he hadn't mapped. "Your mother's sacrifice," he said. "Ancient magic." "Yes. It's why I couldn't touch you for 13 years. It's one reason," Harry said. "One reason," Voldemort repeated. "And the other?" Harry didn't answer that. He looked at the wand in Voldemort's hand, felt the connection between their wands like a string under tension, and felt the two seals in his chest like load-bearing walls, and thought about Narcissa in the stands at every task in 12 books and I'm Glad You're Well and the cupboard that stopped being cold when he was 5 years old. Voldemort cast the killing curse. The green light hit him and the world did something that Harry had read about theoretically and experienced now as physical fact, a folding, a meeting of opposites at a fundamental level, the killing curse which was the ultimate expression of the severing of connection meeting two seals of ancient magic which were the ultimate expression of its making. They were not compatible. They could not coexist. And the result was not an explosion or a dramatic rebound but something quieter and more absolute. The curse simply ceased. Unraveled. Like yarn pulled from a knot, the same dissolution he'd caused in the diary but directed outward, the ancient magic eating the dark energy at its structural level and leaving nothing behind. Harry felt the impact of it in his chest, both seals flaring bright, warm, simultaneous, and stood still. Voldemort stared at him. Again, Voldemort said, and there was something in his voice that Harry identified with interest as the first genuine thing he'd heard from him, not the performance of power, but the actual reaction of someone encountering something outside their model. He cast the curse 4 more times. Each one dissolved. The last one, Harry deflected with a wandless shield that left a visible impression in the air between them, and Voldemort stopped. "What are you?" he said. "I told you," Harry said. "I'm not going to die." He'd thought about this moment for 4 years. He'd considered the tactical options, the legal implications, the things that ended wars versus the things that extended them. He'd considered what killing Tom Riddle would mean and what containing him would mean and what neither would mean, and he'd landed on a position that Hermione had called logistically insane and probably right in the same breath. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, fast enough that Wormtail didn't react, and took Voldemort's wand. Not with a spell. With his hand. Because the wand connection between them was a two-way frequency and the connection between Holly and the Horntail's core was the same resonance as the connection between Voldemort's wand and his own, and when Harry took the wand and held both simultaneously the twin cores sang against each other at a frequency that was, he'd read the term, priori incantatem, the echo of shared sources, and the magic between them did something the books described only in the vaguest theoretical terms. The Horcrux residue in Voldemort, the portion of his soul he'd kept, not divided, the piece he'd come back in, was visible to Harry's ancient magic in the same way the diary's fragment had been visible. He could feel it. It was small. Diminished by the years of disembodiment, the destruction of the diary piece, the incompleteness of the ritual resurrection. It was not invincible. It was not armored. He reached for it with the same movement he'd used in the first-floor bathroom 3 years ago, and let the ancient magic do what it was designed to do. Voldemort screamed. It was not a scream of pain exactly. It was the scream of something being made coherent against its will, the scream of a soul fragment that had been deliberately fractured being asked to feel its own brokenness. Harry held the wand connection and held the ancient magic in full and let it run, and the process took 38 seconds that felt like something entirely different, and at the end of them Voldemort was on the ground and not dead but entirely, completely without magic. A body with no access to its own power. A man with no more ability to cast a spell than a muggle. Not dead. Contained. Harry had thought about this decision for 4 years and had made peace with it and was at peace with it now. Killing created martyrs and disrupted closure. Powerlessness was a different kind of ending, less dramatic, more permanent. You could not lead a movement or recruit followers from a state of total magical incapacitation. You could not be resurrected from something that was still technically alive. He let go of both wands. He went to Cedric, woke him with a counter-curse, and said, "Don't touch the cup when we go back. Wait for the signal." "What signal?" Cedric said, still disoriented. "Me," Harry said, and touched the cup alone. He came back to the maze's entrance on a gust of displacement air and stood up and held the cup above his head, and the crowd's noise was immediate and enormous, and he put the cup down and said to the nearest official, "The graveyard." "Voldemort. Cedric Diggory is there, he needs retrieval. And you need to send a containment team." He said it with the clarity of someone who has already decided how this conversation goes, and the official, a ministry who had the expression of someone whose entire Thursday evening had taken an unexpected direction, went immediately. Dumbledore was at his side in 30 seconds. Harry looked at him steadily. "Tom Riddle is in a graveyard," Harry said. "He's alive. He has no magic. You need to retrieve him before Wormtail does." Dumbledore looked at him with the expression he'd been working toward for 4 years, not the calculation, not the twinkle recalibrating, but something raw and genuine, the expression of a man encountering something that has exceeded his framework. "Harry, later," Harry said. "Containment first." He sat down on the grass because his legs had decided the crisis was over and were enforcing a structural review of his physical situation, which was fair. He was 14 years old and had just neutralized Voldemort with 2 layers of ancient magic and a wandless technique he'd developed at 9, and the legs had a point. He pressed his hand to his chest where both seals were still warm, still bright, still exactly where they'd been since he was 5 years old. He thought, "I'm all right." He felt the warmth respond like a second heartbeat. He thought, "I know you felt that." She was waiting for him outside the castle's main entrance. Not dramatically. Not staged. She was simply there, standing at the edge of the torchlight with her arms at her sides, and she looked at him when he came up the path and he looked at her, and the space between them was smaller than it had ever been, not just physically, but in every other dimension, and they both stopped when there were 3 feet between them. She looked at him for a moment with an expression she wasn't managing. "Both seals," she said. "Yes," he said. "They held." "Yes." She reached out and touched his face, the same hand, the same gesture as the market, but not the same thing, because he was 14 not 5 and she was looking at him like she was finally allowed to. Her thumb moved to the lightning bolt scar and rested there, and her expression was something that belonged to private architecture becoming public. "Tell me," he said. All of it. What you know, what you've researched, what it is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I kissed your forehead in a market when you were 5 years old and I was 31, and I didn't know what I was doing but my magic knew. The Black family always knows, underneath. The ancient magic moved through me because something in me recognized you, not the scar, not the story. You. And it bonded itself to you and bonded you to it, and it's been the most significant thing in my life since the day it happened. I know, he said. You've known for years. Since I was 10, he said. Page 207. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them they were very direct. It's called a soul recognition bond in the oldest texts. The Grey Journal calls it something more clinical. What it means practically is that you are anchored in me, at a magical level, and I am anchored in you, and that's not something that diminishes or resolves. I know, he said again. I'm 38 years old, she said. You're 14. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you for anything that the 14 makes complicated. I'm asking you to stop managing this from the outside. She looked at him. You sent books, he said. You filed legal complaints. You watched tasks from the stands. You've been looking after me for 9 years from the only distances available. I'm not asking you to collapse the distances that need to exist. I'm asking you to stop pretending the connection isn't what it is. She was quiet for a long moment. The torchlight moved in a small wind between them and the castle was warm behind them with its ancient magic, and behind that, somewhere in a graveyard, ministry officials were dealing with the consequences of this evening. Lucius, she said. Is a problem, Harry said. Not tonight's problem. But a problem I intend to address. Draco, she said. Knows more than you think, Harry said. And he told me to tell you. She looked at him sharply. He said, tell my mother. Whatever happens, tell her. Harry held her gaze. So I'm telling you. I'm all right. Both seals held. I did what I prepared to do and it worked, and I'm standing here. Narcissa Black looked at him, 14 years old, lightning bolt scar and green eyes, and the specific quality that she'd recognized when he was 5 and had been recognizing every day since, and the thing she'd been keeping in the locked box of her private architecture since he was 10, the thing she'd named privately and hadn't said aloud, moved up through her chest and she let it. I know what it is, she said. The bond. What it means. What it makes us to each other. She held his gaze. I've known since the ministry atrium. Possibly before. What does it make us, he said, not because he didn't know, but because she needed to say it. It makes us, each other's, she said. In the oldest sense of that. Not presently. Not with everything that has to happen first. But inherently. Fundamentally. She paused. The way north is north. It doesn't require a rival to be true. He looked at her with that expression, the ancient sureness, the not quite a child quality, the thing that had been there when he was 5 and that she'd been watching develop for 9 years into this, a young man who had 2 layers of the most significant magic in recorded history and had just used them to end a war and was standing in torchlight telling her, simply, to stop managing the truth. Good, he said. She made a sound that was caught between a laugh and something else, and reached out again, and this time it wasn't his scar she touched. She put her hand against his cheek, warm and specific, and he reached up and covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a moment in the torchlight with everything still to do, Lucius and Draco and the ministry and the aftermath and all the complex machinery of 2 lives finding their way to the same conclusion, and let it be exactly what it was. Not resolved. Not finished. Recognized. 2 people understanding, at last, the full shape of what they were to each other, not despite the years and the distances and the locked boxes and the gray afternoon, but because of all of it. Because she'd crouched down in a market and looked at him instead of the scar. Because he'd held out his hand. Because something older than either of them had moved through the space between them and neither of them had run from it, and here they were. "Narcissa," he said. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said. "For the warmth. In the cupboard. All those years." She pressed her lips together. It took her a moment. "Thank you," she said finally, "for keeping it." The torchlight moved. The castle breathed. Somewhere above them, Hogwarts, 1,000 years old, built from stone and magic and the accumulated weight of every person who had ever walked its corridors, hummed its ancient note, and in the two seals in Harry Potter's chest, Lily Potter's sacrifice and Narcissa Black's recognition sang the same frequency, different in form and identical in nature, the two most genuine things that had ever been given to him. He held the warmth and she held his hand, and the story began.